Blood soaked through the ivory silk of her wedding dress as Lady Seraphina Vale collapsed against the carriage door. The masked bandits had vanished into the forest, but the damage was done. Her new husband, Duke Julian Arkwright, a man who had married her for money just 3 weeks ago and barely spoken 10 words since, stared at her wound with something that looked like terror. They were 40 miles from the nearest doctor. No help was coming. And as consciousness began to slip away, Seraphina heard him whisper the first genuine words of their marriage. "I won't let you die." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me tell you how a woman worth a fortune became invisible, and how a single bullet shattered a marriage built on silence. If you're watching from London, Manchester, or anywhere in the world, leave your city in the comments. And if you want to see how this story ends, stay until the very last word. Hit that like button and let's begin. The storm hit Blackthorn Chapel like divine punishment. Rain hammered the ancient stone walls with such fury that the organ's melody was nearly drowned out, and the few guests who had bothered to attend sat rigid in their pews, pretending not to notice that this wedding felt more like a funeral. Lady Seraphina Vale stood at the altar in a gown of white silk that cost more than most families earned in a year. Her dark hair pinned with diamonds that had belonged to her mother, her face a perfect mask of composure. She was 23 years old, beautiful in the way that merchants' daughters were often beautiful. Healthy, clear-eyed, intelligent, but not the kind of beauty that made poets weep. Hers was the beauty of someone who had worked for everything she had, who had stood on ship decks in winter winds and pored over ledgers by candlelight. The beauty of capability. Beside her stood Duke Julian Arkwright, 30 years old and handsome in the way that nobility often was. Tall, square-jawed, with dark hair going prematurely silver at the temples. He wore his title like armor, his expression unreadable, his posture military straight. He looked at the priest, at the stained glass windows, at the rain-soaked guests, everywhere except at her. "Do you, Julian Marcus Arkwright, Duke of Ironridge, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" A pause, just long enough for Seraphina to feel the weight of it. "I do." His voice was flat, transactional, the voice of a man signing a business contract, not making a vow. "And do you, Seraphina Margaret Vale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for something, any flicker of warmth, any hint that this was more than what she knew it to be. His gray eyes met hers for half a second, and in that moment she saw nothing. Not cruelty, not kindness, just emptiness. "I do." The priest pronounced them husband and wife. Julian turned to her and she braced herself for the kiss that would seal this hollow union. But he merely touched his lips to her forehead, a gesture so cold, so perfunctory, that it felt like being dismissed rather than claimed. The guests applauded politely. The storm raged on. And Seraphina Vale, now the Duchess of Ironridge, understood with perfect clarity that she had just sold herself. The reception at Ironridge Hall was a study in barely concealed desperation. The estate, when Seraphina first saw it through the rain-streaked carriage window, was magnificent, a sprawling stone manor house with towers and turrets, surrounded by hundreds of acres of parkland. But as they drew closer, the cracks became visible, literally. The western wall showed signs of water damage. Several windows on the third floor were boarded over. The famous Arkwright Gardens, once the pride of the county, had gone wild and weedy. Inside was worse. The ballroom where they held the wedding breakfast was grand, yes, soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, walls covered in portraits of stern-faced ancestors. But the chandelier crystals were clouded with dust. The portraits hung askew, and there were gaps on the walls where other portraits had clearly been removed, leaving rectangular shadows on the faded wallpaper. "Sold," whispered one of the guests, a countess whose name Seraphina had already forgotten. "The family silver went last year. The artwork's been going piece by piece ever since." Seraphina pretended not to hear. She sat at the head table beside her new husband, who was engaged in conversation with Lord something or other about hunting, and tried to eat food that tasted like ash in her mouth. Her father would have laughed at this scene. No, he would have seen through it instantly. Thomas Vale had been a shipping magnate, a man who had built an empire from a single merchant vessel and nerves of steel. He had taught Serafina everything: how to read a profit ledger, how to spot a bad investment, how to navigate by stars and instinct. He had taken her aboard ships when she was barely old enough to walk, had shown her that the world was wider and stranger than the drawing rooms of society would ever admit. "You're worth 10 of any duke," he'd told her once, when she was 16 and some lord's son had treated her like a curiosity at a ball. Don't you ever forget that. But her father was dead now, 6 months in the ground, taken by a fever that came on sudden and merciless. And in his will, he had left everything: the ships, the warehouses, the investments, the massive fortune, to Serafina. Not to a male cousin, not in trust to be managed by solicitors. To her. The Tan had been scandalized. A woman controlling such wealth? Unseemly, dangerous, wrong. The suitors had descended like vultures, and Julian Arkwright, with his ancient title and his failing estate and his desperate need for capital, had been the most persistent. Not the most charming. That honor went to a viscount with gambling debts who'd written her terrible poetry. Not the most honest. A baron had at least admitted he needed money to pay off his mistress, but the most persistent, and the most acceptable to society. A duke, her father's solicitor had said carefully, would provide you protection, status. The Tun would accept you. They'll never accept me, Serafina had thought. They'll accept my money. But she had been so tired. Tired of the fortune hunters, tired of the whispers, tired of being alone in her father's enormous house with only servants and ledgers for company. And some treacherous part of her had thought, maybe this one will be different. Maybe beneath all that aristocratic ice, there's a man who could be a partner. She had been wrong. The wedding night was somehow worse than the ceremony. Julian led her through the halls of Ironridge Hall in silence, their footsteps echoing on marble floors, past more gaps on walls where valuables had been sold, past furniture covered in dust cloths, past windows that rattled in their frames. Finally, they reached the family wing. "Your rooms," Julian said, stopping before a heavy oak door. "Your rooms, not our rooms." He pushed open the door to reveal a suite that must have been beautiful once. The bedroom was vast, with a canopied bed draped in midnight blue velvet, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and tall windows overlooking the storm-dark gardens. An adjoining sitting room held a writing desk, bookshelves, and comfortable chairs. It was also clearly separate from wherever Julian slept. "I trust you'll find everything satisfactory," he said, his tone suggesting he neither trusted nor cared. "Breakfast is served at 8, dinner at 7. If you need anything, ring for the housekeeper." He turned to leave. "Julian." She surprised herself by saying his name. He paused, hand on the doorframe, not quite looking back. "Are you truly not going to explain this?" Serafina heard the edge in her voice, the anger she'd been swallowing all day finally rising. "Separate rooms on our wedding night? Not even the pretense of—" "I believe we both understand what this marriage is," Julian interrupted, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "You needed a title and social standing. I needed capital to save the estate. Those needs have been met. There's no reason to complicate matters with sentimentality." "Sentimentality?" Serafina felt something cold settle in her chest. "You mean basic human decency? Partnership? Even friendship would be—" "I don't need a friend, Lady Arkwright. I need a fortune." Now he did turn, his gray eyes meeting hers with terrible clarity. "Your money will restore Ironridge, and in exchange, you'll have everything society can offer. That was the arrangement. I intend to honor it." "And children?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Heirs? Surely the great Duke of Ironridge needs—" "Eventually," Julian said, the word sharp as a blade, "when the estate is stable, when it's practical. Until then, you have your rooms, your allowance, and your new title. Isn't that what you wanted?" He left before she could answer. Serafina stood in the middle of her gilded cage, rain lashing against the windows, and finally let the mask slip. Not tears, she wouldn't give him tears, but her hand shook as she removed the diamond pins from her hair, and her reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. "You're worth 10 of any duke," her father's voice echoing in her memory. But right now, locked in a beautiful prison, married to a man who saw her as nothing more than a solution to his debts, she felt worthless. By same. The next morning brought no improvement. Breakfast was a silent affair. Julian sat at one end of an absurdly long dining table, reading correspondence and occasionally making notes. Serafina sat at the other end, picking at eggs she didn't want while a footman hovered nearby, looking profoundly uncomfortable. The west pastures need draining, Julian said suddenly, not looking up from his papers, and the tenant farmers are behind on rent again. We'll need to renegotiate the leases. Serafina waited for him to continue, to perhaps ask her opinion or at least acknowledge her presence. He didn't. The harvest was poor this year, she ventured, remembering what she'd read in the estate reports her father's solicitor had provided before the wedding. If the tenants can't pay, perhaps deferring the rent until spring. That's not how estates work, Julian said, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. If we don't collect rent, we can't maintain the land. If we can't maintain the land, it degrades. It's quite simple. I understand that. I'm suggesting that tenant welfare and land productivity are connected. I'll handle the estate management, Julian interrupted, finally looking at her. You focus on whatever it is duchesses focus on. Redecorate, plan parties, needlework. The dismissal was so casual, so absolute that Serafina felt anger flash hot in her chest. She opened her mouth to tell him exactly what she thought of his condescension, to remind him that she had managed a shipping empire while he was busy losing his inheritance. But the footman was watching. The butler had appeared in the doorway. This wasn't a private moment. It was a performance, and Julian had just made clear what role she was expected to play. The invisible wife. The decorative duchess. The walking, talking bank account. Of course, Serafina said, her voice ice cold. I wouldn't want to trouble you with my thoughts. Julian had already returned to his correspondence. The days that followed established a pattern that Serafina came to know with soul-crushing familiarity. Julian rose early and spent his mornings riding the estate, inspecting land he could barely afford to maintain. He took lunch alone in his study, poring over ledgers that told a story of slow financial death. He dined with Serafina precisely at 7 each evening, the only time they were forced into each other's company, making stilted conversation about nothing that mattered. The weather should hold through the weekend. The Duchess of Marlborough sent her regards. I'll be traveling to London next week for parliamentary business. Never. What did you do today? What are you thinking? Are you as miserable as I am? Serafina filled her hours the way she imagined other neglected wives did. She explored the estate. She read in the library. She wrote letters that went unanswered. But unlike those other wives, she couldn't stop her merchant's mind from working. And everywhere she looked at Iron Ridge Hall, she saw problems. The tenant farmers weren't lazy or unproductive. They were working degraded land with outdated equipment. The sheep were a poor breed for the local climate. The drainage systems had been installed 50 years ago and never updated. Half the estate's income came from timber, but the forests were being overlogged without any replanting plan. It was death by 1,000 small inefficiencies, each one fixable, all of them adding up to catastrophe. She tried once to bring it up at dinner. I was walking the lower pastures today, she said carefully, and I noticed the irrigation channels are blocked with silt. If we cleared them before winter, the spring flooding might… Serafina. Julian set down his wineglass with exaggerated patience. I appreciate your interest, but agriculture is complex. You can't simply look at a problem and assume you understand the solution. I manage 6 warehouses and coordinated shipping routes across 3 continents, Serafina said, her temper finally breaking loose. I think I can understand silt. Managing a business and managing land are entirely different things. Yes, land doesn't require you to predict weather patterns, calculate risk, or coordinate with unpredictable people. Oh, wait. It's exactly the same. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in Julian's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or a grudging respect. But it vanished as quickly as it came. The estate has been managed by Arkwrights for 300 years, he said coldly. I hardly think it needs input from someone who's been here 3 weeks. Your family has been managing it into the ground, Serafina shot back. Maybe that's exactly why it needs new input. Julian stood. I'm dining in my study from now on. Good evening, Lady Arkwright. He left her alone at the table, surrounded by too much food and too much silence. A month into her marriage, Serafina discovered the shipping ledgers. She had been exploring the East Wing, the section of the house that Julian never mentioned, where dust lay thick and furniture stood shrouded like ghosts. Her footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and she felt like an intruder in her own home. But at least here, in the abandoned rooms, she could breathe. She found the study by accident, drawn by a shaft of afternoon light through a gap in the curtains. Unlike the rest of the wing, this room showed signs of recent use: disturbed dust patterns on the desk, ash in the fireplace that was only days old, and stacked on a credenza, half hidden behind a fallen curtain, were ledgers. Serafina recognized them immediately: shipping ledgers, with the Arkwright crest stamped on the spines. He told me he didn't involve himself in the shipping business, she thought, pulling one free. He told me his solicitors handled it. She opened the ledger to the most recent entries, and her blood went cold. The Arkwright Shipping Company, the small fleet that had come with Julian's title, was hemorrhaging money. Not from normal operating costs or market competition, from stunningly bad decisions. Ships dispatched to ports where they had no trade agreements. Cargoes purchased at peak prices and sold at losses. Routes that made no geographic or economic sense, as if someone had planned them while looking at a map upside down. And there, in Julian's own handwriting, Northern Passage approved. The Meridian Star departs next week. No, Serafina whispered aloud. No, no, no. The Northern Passage, the route along the Scottish coast that promised to cut journey times by a third, but was legendary for destroying ships. Rocky shoals hidden by fog. Currents that could smash a vessel against cliffs before the crew even knew they were off course. Her father had lost a ship there 7 years ago, had sworn never to risk it again. She checked the date on the entry. The Meridian Star had already been gone for 2 weeks. Serafina found Julian in his study, bent over correspondence by candlelight, even though it was barely evening. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence until she slammed the shipping ledger onto his desk. "You sent a ship through the Northern Passage," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." Julian glanced at the ledger, then back at his letters. "That's company business, Serafina. It doesn't concern you." "It's my money funding that company. It absolutely concerns me." "Your money became my money when we married. That's how this works." He signed a letter with a flourish, deliberately calm. "The Northern Passage is faster. Time saved means nothing if the ship doesn't arrive." Serafina couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That route is a graveyard. My father lost the Sapphire there, 12 men dead, a full cargo gone. No one with any sense uses it." Your father was overly cautious. The casual dismissal of Thomas Vale, a man who had built an empire through calculated risk and brilliant seamanship, made something inside Serafina snap. "My father was brilliant," she said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "He understood that shipping isn't about the fastest route. It's about the route that actually gets you there. The Northern Passage has fog banks that last for days, currents that shift hourly, rocks that don't appear on any chart. It's suicide. I've consulted with the captain." "Which captain?" "Let me guess. Young? Ambitious? Desperate to prove himself?" Serafina saw the answer in Julian's face. "Of course. Because an experienced captain would have told you no." Julian stood, his patience clearly exhausted. "I'm managing the business as I see fit. If you can't trust my judgment, your judgment is going to get men killed." Serafina slammed her hand on the desk. "And destroy the one profitable asset you have left. The Meridian Star is worth 40,000 pounds. If she goes down, she won't. You can't know that." "I know enough." Julian's voice had gone very quiet, very cold. "I know that I've been managing estate affairs since I was 19 years old. I know that I don't need a merchant's daughter who's been playing at business for a few years to tell me how to run a company that's been in my family for generations." The contempt in his voice was like a slap. "Playing at business," Serafina repeated slowly. "I ran 6 warehouses. I negotiated contracts with sea captains who'd eaten men like you for breakfast. I've stood on deck in storms that would make you weep and plotted courses by dead reckoning. But I was playing at it." "Serafina, no." She grabbed the ledger, held it up. You want to know what this shows me? It shows me a man who's so terrified of losing his precious heritage that he's making desperate, stupid decisions. It shows me someone who's in so far over his head that he can't even see the water anymore. Get out of my study. Gladly. Serafina turned toward the door, then stopped. When that ship goes down, and it will go down, Julian, remember this conversation. Remember that someone tried to warn you, someone who actually knew what they were talking about. She left him there, surrounded by his letters and his pride and his 300 years of Arkwright tradition. 3 days later, a rider arrived from the port. The Meridian Star had vanished. The messenger was young, rain-soaked, and clearly terrified to be delivering bad news to a duke. He stood in the entry hall, dripping on the marble, twisting his cap in his hands. "Speak," Julian commanded, his voice tight. "The Meridian Star, Your Grace. She's been gone 2 weeks past expected arrival. The harbor master sent boats up the coast. They found wreckage. The ship's nameplate. Some cargo crates." Serafina, who had been passing through the hall when the messenger arrived, felt her stomach drop. "Bodies?" Julian asked. "None yet, Your Grace, but with the rocks in that area and the currents..." The messenger swallowed. "The harbor master says there's no hope. She went down in the northern passage, just like that." "That's enough." Julian's face had gone absolutely white. "You're dismissed." The messenger fled. For a long moment, Julian stood motionless, staring at nothing. Then very slowly, he turned to look at Serafina. She waited for the apology, the acknowledgement, anything that might suggest he understood what had just happened. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't say it. Don't tell me you warned me. Don't." His voice cracked, just slightly. "Just don't." He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. Serafina watched him go and felt something shift inside her. Not satisfaction. There was nothing satisfying about 12 men dead and 40,000 pounds lost. But clarity. Julian Arkwright was drowning. His estate, his fortune, his pride, all of it was going under, and he was too stubborn or too scared to grab the rope being thrown to him. Well, she was done throwing ropes. If he wanted to drown, she couldn't stop him. But she was damned if she was going down with him. The weeks following the loss of the Meridian Star were the coldest of Serafina's life. Julian retreated into himself completely. He stopped taking meals with her, breakfast, lunch, dinner, all taken alone in his study or not at all. He barely slept. She could hear him pacing his rooms at night, back and forth, back and forth. The few times she encountered him in the halls, he looked like a man haunted. The estate fell into a pall. Servants whispered in corners. Creditors began arriving with increasing frequency. The shipping company, which had been barely profitable before, now faced ruin. And Serafina, the woman with a fortune and a mind sharp enough to fix it all, was invisible. She threw herself into the only thing she could control, learning everything about Iron Ridge Hall. She spent hours in the library reading account books going back decades, tracing the slow decline of the estate. She walked the land until she knew every field, every tenant, every problem. She befriended the housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, who proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge and the only person who treated her like a human being. "The Duke's a proud man," Mrs. Thornton said one afternoon, serving Serafina tea in her sitting room. "Too proud, if you ask me. His father was the same way. Would rather lose everything than admit he needed help." "Did they lose everything?" Serafina asked. "Near enough. The old Duke died with debts up to his ears, and young Julian, he was only 19 when he inherited. Tried to fix it all himself, wouldn't listen to advisors, wouldn't modernize." Mrs. Thornton shook her head. "He's been fighting to save this place for 11 years, fighting alone, and losing, bit by bit." "He doesn't have to be alone," Serafina said quietly. "I've offered to help, and he'd rather die than accept, I'll wager." The housekeeper gave her a sympathetic look. "Men like him, Your Grace, they've been taught that accepting help is weakness, especially from a woman, especially from a wife who knows more than they do." Then he's going to die, Serafina thought, and take everything with him. But she didn't say it aloud. 2 months after the wedding, everything changed. Julian announced at breakfast, the first meal they'd shared in weeks. that he was traveling to inspect the port holdings in person. The shipping company was in chaos after the Meridian Star disaster. Captains were refusing routes, investors were pulling out, and the harbor master had sent word of irregularities that required the Duke's immediate attention. "I'll be gone a fortnight," Julian said, still not quite looking at her. "Perhaps 3 weeks." "I'd like to come with you," Serafina said. That made him look up. "Why?" "Because I know more about shipping than you ever will. Because I might actually be able to help. Because I'm going mad in this house with nothing to do. Because I'd like to see the coast," she said instead. "I haven't been near the sea since Father died." It was the first time she'd mentioned her father to Julian. Something flickered in his eyes, discomfort maybe, or guilt. "It's not a pleasure trip," he said carefully. "There'll be meetings with captains, inspections, tedious business matters. I understand business matters." "Serafina, I'm going." She said it quietly, but with absolute finality. "I'm your wife. I'm allowed to accompany you." For a moment she thought he'd refuse outright, but then he just sighed, looking more tired than angry. "Pack lightly," he said. "We leave at dawn." But the journey to the coast took 3 days by carriage, through countryside that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. Rolling farmland gave way to heath, then to rocky hills where sheep grazed and ancient stone walls divided the land into irregular parcels. They barely spoke during the trip. Julian spent most of his time reviewing papers, and Serafina watched the landscape roll by, remembering journeys she'd taken with her father. He would have loved this country, she thought. Would have wanted to know about the geology, the local industries, the history written in every stone wall. On the second night, they stopped at a coaching inn. Over dinner in a private parlor, the first meal they'd shared in nearly a month, Julian finally broke the silence. "You must hate this," he said abruptly. Serafina looked up from her plate. "Hate what?" "All of it. The marriage, the isolation, me." He met her eyes for perhaps the first time since the wedding. "I wouldn't blame you, Aim." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in 2 months. "I don't hate you," Serafina said slowly. "I'm angry with you, frustrated, disappointed, but I don't hate you. That's almost worse." "Why?" "Because hate would be simpler." Julian set down his fork. "You could hate me for trapping you in a loveless marriage, for taking your money, for treating you like a particularly valuable piece of furniture. But you're too reasonable for that, aren't you? You understand exactly why I did it. Understanding doesn't make it hurt less." "I know." He looked away. "For what it's worth, I didn't expect to feel guilty. I thought we both understood the arrangement, but watching you these past weeks, seeing you wander that empty house like a ghost..." He cut himself off. "I'm not good at this." "At what? Conversation? Basic human decency?" "At admitting I might have been wrong. It wasn't an apology, but it was something." "About the marriage?" Serafina asked. "Or about the Meridian Star?" Julian flinched. "Both. Neither. I don't know." He rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking much older than 30. "Do you know what it's like to inherit a legacy that's already dying? To know that 300 years of your family's history is ending on your watch?" "No," Serafina said honestly. "But I know what it's like to lose the only person who ever saw your potential. My father believed I could run an empire. Society thinks I should do needlework." "You're better than needlework." "I know, but you won't let me be." Julian was silent for a long moment. Then, "When we get to the port, stay close. Watch the meetings. If you see something I'm missing, if you have ideas, tell me. Privately, preferably, but tell me." It wasn't partnership, but it was a crack in the wall. "I will," Serafina said. That night, sleeping in a room at the coaching inn, she dreamed of her father for the first time since the wedding. He was standing on a ship's deck, laughing at a storm, his hair wild in the wind. "You're worth 10 of any duke," he said. "Remember that." "I'm trying, Papa," she whispered in the dream. "I'm trying." They reached Port Caldwell on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and Serafina fell in love. The town clung to the cliffs like a barnacle, all steep streets and salt-weathered stone, with the harbor spread below like a merchant's dream. Ships crowded the docks, merchant vessels, fishing boats, even a naval frigate. The smell of tar and fish and sea wind hit her the moment they descended from the carriage, and she breathed it in like wine. "It's beautiful," she said. Julian gave her an odd look. "It's a working port. It smells like dead fish. It smells like opportunity." The harbor master, a grizzled man named Davies, met them at the company offices with a ledger full of problems. Unpaid bills, ships sitting idle because crews had deserted, cargo rotting on docks because merchants no longer trusted Arkwright Shipping to deliver. "It's the Meridian Star, Your Grace," Davies explained, spreading the damage across his desk. "Word got out that she went down in the Northern Passage, and now everyone's saying the Arkwrights have lost their touch. Captains don't want to sail for you. Merchants don't want to ship with you." "We need to restore confidence," Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Respectfully, Your Grace, confidence isn't the problem. Competence is." Davies pulled out another ledger. "These routes you've been approving, they make no sense. Ships to ports where we have no contracts, cargoes that won't sell. It's like someone's planning this without looking at maps or market conditions." Serafina saw Julian's jaw tighten. She thought of the shipping ledgers she'd found, the decisions that had baffled her. "May I see?" she asked quietly. Both men looked at her, Davies with surprise, Julian with resignation. "Lady Arkwright has experience in trade," Julian said, the words clearly painful. Serafina took the ledger and began reading. Within minutes, she'd identified the pattern. "You're using outdated trade agreements," she said. "These ports, you had contracts with them, but those expired years ago. And you're buying cargo based on old price lists. The market's shifted." Davies blinked. Yes, exactly right, Your Grace." "It's Lady Arkwright," Serafina corrected absently, still reading. "And your ship assignments are wrong too. You've got the Osprey. She's built for speed, shallow draft, running heavy cargo on deep water routes, while the Cormorant, deep-keeled, built for stability, is doing coastal runs where she can't use her advantages." "How do you—" Davies started. "My father owned ships," Serafina said simply. "I know their types." She looked up at Julian. "Who's been planning your routes?" "I have," Julian said stiffly. "Based on what information?" "The same ledgers and maps the family's always used." "How old are those maps?" Julian didn't answer, which was answer enough. Serafina set down the ledger and looked at Davies. "The routes can be fixed. The ship assignments can be corrected. And we can rebuild the merchant relationships. It'll take time, but it's possible. The real question is, are the ships themselves sound?" "Mechanically?" Davies nodded. "Ships are good, crews are good, when we can keep them. It's the management that's killing us." "Then we fix the management," Serafina said. Julian was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple." She met his eyes. "You've been trying to run a shipping company using methods from your grandfather's time. The world's changed. You need to change with it. And you know how to do that." It wasn't quite a question, but Serafina answered anyway. "Yes, I do." For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then he turned to Davies. "Give Lady Arkwright full access to the ledgers. Everything. Route logs, cargo manifests, crew rosters, all of it." Davies looked between them, clearly confused by this development, but nodded. "As you wish, Your Grace." "And Davies?" Julian's voice was quiet. "When Lady Arkwright makes recommendations, implement them, as if they were coming from me." "Your Grace, that's an order." After Davies left, Serafina and Julian stood alone in the office, the sound of the harbor drifting through the windows. "Thank you," Serafina said finally. "Don't thank me yet. If you can't fix this, we're ruined." Julian picked up the ledger, stared at it like it might bite him. "I've been drowning for so long, I forgot there might be another way." "There's always another way." "Is there?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. "You meant what you said, didn't you? About knowing ships, trade, all of it." "Every word." "Then I've been a fool." "Yes," Serafina said. "But you're a fool who just gave me a chance. That counts for something." Julian almost smiled. Almost. Let's see what you can do, Lady Arkwright. They spent the next week in Port Caldwell, and it was the first time since the wedding that Seraphina felt like herself. She pored over ledgers, interviewed captains, walked the docks at dawn to watch the ships and the tides. She found the problems Davies had only glimpsed: corrupt factors, poorly negotiated contracts, cargo storage that was actively damaging goods. And she fixed them, one by one, with Julian watching in what looked like fascinated horror. "You're enjoying this," he said one evening, finding her in the office still working by lamplight. "I haven't felt useful in months," Seraphina said, not looking up from the cargo manifest she was reorganizing. "So yes, I'm enjoying it. I thought women of your class wanted balls and parties." "I'm not of your class, remember? I'm a merchant's daughter who married up." She did look up then, caught his expression. "What?" "Nothing, just... I'm beginning to think you married down." It wasn't a compliment, not exactly, but coming from Julian Arkwright, it might as well have been a declaration of love. They left Port Caldwell with the shipping company stable, not thriving yet, but no longer actively dying. Davies had strict new instructions, the ships had new routes, and 3 merchants had tentatively agreed to resume contracts. And for the first time, Julian looked at Seraphina like she was a person. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The attack came on the second day of their return journey in the deep woods between Caldwell and Iron Ridge, where the road narrowed and old trees grew thick. They never saw it coming. One moment, the carriage was rolling steadily through dappled afternoon sunlight. The next, masked men on horseback were flooding out of the trees, guns drawn, surrounding them completely. "Stand and deliver," one of them shouted, his voice rough through the cloth mask. The driver pulled the horses to a halt. Inside the carriage, Julian swore and reached for something. A pistol, Seraphina realized. But there were too many of them. At least 6, maybe more. "Don't," she said quietly. "You'll get us both killed." "I'm not letting them." The carriage door was ripped open. "Out!" the lead bandit commanded. "Both of you, nice and slow." Julian climbed out first, his hands raised, his face a mask of controlled fury. Seraphina followed, her heart hammering, but her mind strangely clear. She'd heard about highway robberies, had even had one of her father's coaches robbed once. Usually, if you gave them the valuables, they left you alive. Usually. "Jewelry," the lead bandit said, gesturing with his pistol. "Money. All of it. Now." Seraphina began removing her rings with shaking fingers. Beside her, Julian was doing the same, his movements stiff with rage. "This is the Duke of Iron Ridge," one of the other bandits said suddenly, his voice younger, excited. "Look at the crest on the carriage. That's the Arkwright crest." The lead bandit's eyes, all that was visible beneath the mask, gleamed. "Well, well, Your Grace, this is an honor. Take what you want and leave," Julian said, his voice like ice. "Oh, we will, but you see, we have a problem." The bandit moved closer, pistol steady. "Word is, the Duke of Iron Ridge just married himself a fortune. A big, beautiful fortune. And we're wondering how much of that fortune you might be carrying." "We're not carrying anything significant." "Liar." The pistol moved to point at Seraphina. "Maybe the Duchess would be more honest?" "Leave her out of this," Julian said, and Seraphina heard something new in his voice. "Fear." "Can't do that, Your Grace. See, we know all about Lady Arkwright. The shipping magnate's daughter. The woman who controls the Vale fortune." The bandit smiled beneath his mask. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell us where you keep the real money. The account numbers, the locations, all of it." "Go to hell," Seraphina said. The bandit's expression hardened. "Wrong answer." He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Seraphina felt the impact before she felt the pain, a punch to her left side just below the ribs that drove the breath from her lungs and sent her stumbling backward. Then came the pain, sharp, burning, spreading. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her traveling dress, dark and fast spreading. Her hand came away red when she touched it. "Seraphina!" Julian's voice, hoarse with shock. "That was a warning shot," the bandit said calmly. "Next one goes in her chest. Now talk." But Serafina was falling, the world tilting sideways, her legs no longer holding her. She heard Julian shouting, heard more gunshots. The driver? The footman? She couldn't tell. Everything was noise and confusion, and the terrible spreading warmth of blood. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Julian, kneeling in the dirt, holding her against his chest. "Stay with me," he was saying, his voice breaking. "Serafina, stay with me. Don't you dare." More shouting, the thunder of hooves, the bandits fleeing. She couldn't focus. The pain was everything now, white-hot and consuming. "We need to get her to a doctor," someone said, the driver, his voice shaking. "Nearest town is 20 miles south." "She won't survive 20 miles in the carriage," Julian said. His hands were pressed against her wound, trying to stop the bleeding, his face above hers stark white. "She's losing too much blood." "Then what?" "There's a village. 8 miles north, straight through the forest. They'll have a doctor. They have to." Julian looked down at her, and Serafina saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Desperation. "I'm going to carry you. Do you understand? I'm going to get you there." "Julian," Serafina managed, the word wet and painful. "Can't." 8 miles. "Yes, I can. I will." He shifted, gathering her into his arms, and she cried out as the movement tore through her. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I'm not letting you die." He started walking. And Serafina, bleeding and broken in the arms of a man who had barely looked at her for 2 months, finally understood that something had changed. She just wasn't sure either of them would survive long enough for it to matter. The first mile was agony. Julian's boots crunched over fallen leaves and broken branches as he pushed through the forest, Serafina's weight growing heavier with each step. She had stopped making sounds, whether from shock or unconsciousness, he couldn't tell, but he could feel the warmth of her blood soaking through his shirt, could hear the shallow rasp of her breathing against his chest. 8 miles. The village was 8 miles north through unmarked wilderness. He had never walked 8 miles in his life. "Stay with me," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Just stay with me." Behind them, the driver had taken the carriage south toward the main road, hoping to find help or at least summon the magistrate. But Julian knew the truth. By the time anyone came, it would be too late. The only chance was forward, through the trees, through the darkness that was already gathering as afternoon faded toward evening. His arms were already burning. The forest closed around them like a fist. Ancient oaks and ash trees blocked out the fading sunlight, their branches creating a canopy so thick that Julian had to navigate by instinct more than sight. There was no path here, no road, just the vague direction of north and the desperate hope that he was going the right way. Serafina stirred in his arms, a small sound escaping her lips. "I know," Julian said, adjusting his grip even though every muscle in his shoulders screamed. "I know it hurts, but I need you to hold on. Can you do that? Just hold on." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dark with pain. "Julian, I'm here. I've got you. Can't. Too far?" "It's not too far. It's nothing. A stroll through the park." His voice was shaking, betraying the lie. "We'll be there before you know it." "Liar," she whispered, but there was something almost like affection in it. Then her eyes closed again, and Julian felt terror spike through him. "No, no, no! Serafina, open your eyes! Look at me!" He stopped walking, jostled her slightly despite knowing it would hurt. "Look at me!" Her eyelids lifted, just barely, still breathing, still alive. Julian started walking again. The second mile was worse than the first. His legs had begun to shake, his breathing coming hard and fast. Serafina wasn't a large woman, but carrying 120 pounds of dead weight through rough terrain was breaking him down faster than he'd imagined possible. Sweat poured down his face despite the autumn chill. His boots, made for riding rather than hiking, rubbed blisters onto his heels, and still the forest stretched endlessly ahead. "Tell me about the ships," he said suddenly, desperately needing to hear her voice. Serafina didn't respond. "The ships, Serafina, the ones your father owned. Tell me about them." He stumbled over a root, nearly fell, caught himself at the last second. You said you knew their types. How did you learn that? Silence. Just her ragged breathing and the sound of his own footsteps. My father took me aboard when I was 6, Julian said instead, talking to fill the terrible quiet. The cormorant. She was new then, just commissioned. I remember thinking she was the biggest thing I'd ever seen, like a floating castle. He had no idea if she could hear him, but he kept talking anyway. I wanted to be a sailor. Can you believe that? The heir to Iron Ridge, wanting to run away to sea. A bitter laugh escaped him. My father forbade it, of course. Said Arkwrights manage estates, not ships. We hire captains for that. Another stumble. This time he did fall, going down on one knee, barely managing to keep Serafina from hitting the ground. Pain lanced through his kneecap, and he tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. Get up, he told himself. Get up, you useless bastard. He got up. Mile 3. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving only the gray twilight that filtered through the trees. Julian's vision was starting to blur at the edges, his arms numb from shoulder to fingertip. Every step was a negotiation with his failing body. Just one more, just one more, just one more. I was wrong, he said, his voice cracking. About everything. About you. About the marriage. I thought I was so clever, marrying a fortune to save the estate. But you weren't a fortune, you were a person. A brilliant, capable person who I treated like furniture. Serafina's head lolled against his shoulder. He couldn't tell if she was conscious anymore. I'm sorry, Julian said. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry. For the separate rooms, for the silence, for not listening when you tried to help, for being too proud and too stupid to see what I had. His boot caught on something, and he went down hard this time, twisting as he fell to take the impact on his back and shoulder, rather than let Serafina hit the ground. The air left his lungs in a rush, and for a moment he just lay there in the dirt and dead leaves, staring up at the darkening sky through the branches. He could stop, just for a moment, just to catch his breath. If you stop, she dies. The thought was like ice water. Julian forced himself to sit up, his entire body one massive bruise. Serafina was still in his arms, still breathing, barely, wetly, but breathing. Not yet, he whispered. Not yet, not yet, not yet. He stood, his legs nearly buckled. He locked his knees and kept walking. Mile 4. The darkness was nearly complete now, just the faintest gray light remaining. Julian could barely see where he was putting his feet, stumbling blind through the forest, navigating by sheer desperate will. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes. None of it mattered. When we get back to Iron Ridge, he said, his voice slurred with exhaustion, things are going to change. No more separate rooms, no more silence. We're going to be partners, really partners. You'll manage the shipping company, all of it, not just when I deign to let you help. He stepped in a hidden hole and nearly went down again, caught himself on a tree trunk. And I'll listen to you. About the estate, about everything. No more dismissing your ideas because you're a woman or because you're not nobility. You're smarter than me. I should have seen that from the start. Was her breathing getting shallower? He couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't feel anything except the weight of her and the trembling of his own muscles. Just hold on, he pleaded. Please, Serafina, hold on. Mile 5. Julian's mind was starting to fracture. He kept seeing things in the darkness, shapes that might be trees or might be bandits, shadows that moved and twisted. Once he was certain he heard voices and froze, terrified that the robbers had followed them. But it was just the wind, just his imagination. His arms had gone beyond pain into a kind of numb horror. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't tell if he was still gripping Serafina properly or if she was about to slip from his grasp. He had to look down every few steps to make sure he was still holding her. My father died in debt, Julian heard himself saying, the words spilling out unbidden. Everyone knows the estate was failing, but they don't know how bad. He'd sold everything, the artwork, the silver, even his mother's jewelry, and it still wasn't enough. He was crying now, tears mixing with sweat on his face. I was 19 years old, and suddenly I was responsible for 300 years of history, for tenants and servants, and a legacy that was already dying. I tried everything, new farming methods, cutting costs, anything I could think of. But I was just a boy playing at being a duke. Serafina made a sound, small, pained. You're awake, Julian said, fresh hope flooding through him. Thank God you're awake. Julian, her voice was barely a whisper. Put me down. No. Too heavy. Can't. Make it. I can make it. I will make it. He adjusted his grip, fresh agony shooting through his shoulders. I've carried this estate for 11 years. I can carry you for 8 miles. Stubborn? Bastard? Yes. Yes, I am. He almost laughed. Now stop talking and save your strength. For what? For staying alive. For yelling at me later. For running the shipping company and fixing all my mistakes. His voice broke. For giving me a chance to be the husband I should have been from the start. She was silent for a long moment. Then, idiot. I know. Not you. Me. Her hand moved weakly against his chest. Believed the fairy tale. Duke would love me. Serafina knew better. Father taught me better, but wanted what? What did you want? Her breathing was getting worse, more labored. Wanted someone to see me. Not the money, just me. Julian's throat closed up. I see you now. I swear I see you. Too late. No, it's not too late. We're almost there. The village is close. I can feel it. He was lying. He had no idea where they were, how far they'd come, whether he was even walking in the right direction anymore. Just hold on a little longer. Julian, don't. Don't say goodbye. Don't you dare. If I die, you're not going to die. If I die, she continued, her voice fading, tell Mrs. Thornton she was right. Tell her I should have packed more dresses. Then she went limp in his arms. Serafina? Serafina! Julian shook her, gentle at first, then harder. Open your eyes. Please, open your eyes. Nothing. Just the terrible stillness of unconsciousness. Or worse. Julian pressed his fingers to her neck, searching desperately for a pulse. There, faint, thready, but there. Still alive. Still a chance. He started running. His body protested with every step, muscles tearing, lungs screaming, but he ran. Crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal, branches tearing at his face, roots trying to trip him. He fell twice, rolled, got back up, and kept running. The darkness was absolute now, the forest a maze of shadows and pain. Help! He shouted, his voice raw. Someone help us! Please! Only the forest answered, silent and indifferent. Julian's legs gave out. He went down hard, unable to catch himself this time, landing in a heap with Serafina still clutched against his chest. His vision swam. His arms had locked around her, muscles in spasm, and he couldn't let go even if he wanted to. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm so sorry. I tried so hard. He didn't know how long he lay there. Time had stopped meaning anything. He just held her in the darkness, feeling her pulse grow fainter, feeling his own strength drain away into the earth. This was how it would end. Not in the ballrooms of London or the halls of Iron Ridge, but here, in the mud and leaves, holding the woman he'd treated as a transaction while she bled to death in his arms. The cruelest part was that he finally understood what he'd lost. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it. A dog barking, and beneath that, impossibly distant, the creak of a cartwheel. Julian lifted his head. There, through the trees, barely visible. Was that light? Help! He screamed, putting every last ounce of strength into it. Help us! Please! The light stopped moving. Please! Julian tried to stand, failed, tried again. His legs were useless. He started crawling instead, dragging Serafina with him, pulling them both across the forest floor toward that distant light. Please, there's been an accident. My wife is hurt. The light was getting closer. Or was he getting closer to it? He couldn't tell anymore. Help us, he sobbed. Someone help us. Footsteps. Voices. The light became a lantern, held by a man in rough homespun clothes, his weathered face shocked. Lord above, the man breathed. What happened to you? Shot, Julian managed. Bandits! Need... Doctor! Finn! Mary! The man shouted over his shoulder. Get the cart! We've got wounded! More people appeared, materializing out of the darkness like miracles. Rough hands, gentle despite their calluses, lifted Serafina from Julian's arms. He tried to hold on, but his muscles had finally given up completely. Easy there, sir, a woman's voice said. We've got her. You just rest. The village, Julian gasped. Is this... Are we... Aye. You're at the edge of Millbrook. The doctor's just up the road. The woman looked at Serafina, and Julian saw her expression tighten. Finn, run ahead. Tell Dr. Aldridge we're coming, and it's bad. Is she... Julian couldn't finish the question. She's breathing. That's what matters. The woman met his eyes. You carried her all this way? Had to. No choice. Through the thornwood? In the dark? The woman shook her head in disbelief. That's 8 miles of rough country. Most men couldn't do it in daylight with no burden. Julian tried to answer, but the world was tilting sideways, darkness closing in from the edges. Sir, stay with me. But the darkness took him, and Julian fell into it gratefully, knowing that he'd done the only thing that mattered. He'd gotten her there alive. When Julian woke, dawn light was streaming through a window he didn't recognize. He was lying in a bed, narrow, with rough sheets that smelled of lye soap, in a room that was small and plainly furnished. His entire body felt like one massive bruise. When he tried to sit up, pain lanced through his shoulders and back so intensely that he gasped. Easy now. A man appeared in his field of vision, middle-aged, balding, with the no-nonsense manner of someone used to dealing with difficult patients. You've torn just about every muscle in your upper body. You're not going anywhere for a while. Serafina, Julian croaked. My wife. Where is she? In the next room. And before you ask, she's alive. The doctor, this must be Dr. Aldridge, pulled up a chair. Though she shouldn't be given how much blood she lost. The bullet went clean through, missed anything vital by about half an inch. Pure luck. Can I see her? Later. Right now you need to rest, and so does she. Aldridge gave him a stern look. You carried her 8 miles through the thornwood, in the dark. Do you have any idea how insane that was? It was the only option. It was suicide. You could have gotten lost, fallen and broken her neck. Hell, you could have walked straight off a cliff. There's 3 of them in those woods. The doctor shook his head. But you didn't. Somehow, you made it. Julian closed his eyes. I didn't know if I was going the right direction. I just kept walking. You were off course by about a mile. If you'd kept going straight, you'd have walked right past the village. Aldridge stood. Someone was watching over you. Or we were just lucky, Julian thought, but he didn't say it aloud. When can I see her? He asked again. This afternoon, if she wakes. Right now, sleep. Doctor's orders. But Julian couldn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the journey through the forest. The weight of her in his arms. The terror that she would die before he could save her. The awful realization that he had wasted 2 months treating her like an inconvenience when she was the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. If she survived this, when she survived this, everything would change. He would make it change, assuming she ever forgave him. The door opened quietly, and a woman entered, the same one from the night before, he realized. Mary, they'd called her. You're awake, she said, setting down a tray with bread, cheese, and water. Good. You need to eat. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Doctor says you're half starved and completely exhausted. You won't be any good to your wife if you collapse again. The mention of Serafina made Julian's stomach clench. How is she really? Tell me the truth. Mary hesitated, then sighed. She's weak, lost a lot of blood, and the wound's infected. Dr. Aldridge cleaned it as best he could, but she trailed off. The next few days will tell. She's strong, Julian said, more to convince himself than her. She'll need to be. Mary handed him a piece of bread. Eat, then you can see her. Julian forced himself to eat, though the food tasted like cardboard. When he'd finished, Mary helped him out of bed. His legs shook like a newborn colt's, and supported him as he shuffled to the next room. Serafina lay in a bed identical to his, so pale that she looked like a corpse. Bandages wrapped her torso, already showing spots of blood seeping through. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, and her eyes were closed. Julian sank into the chair beside the bed, his own pain forgotten. "I'll give you some privacy," Mary said quietly, and left. Alone with his unconscious wife, Julian didn't know what to say. So he just took her hand, the one that wasn't bruised from where the bandits had ripped off her rings, and held it gently. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Her fingers were cold. He rubbed them carefully, trying to warm them. "You were right about everything," he continued. "The routes, the ships, the management. I should have listened from the start. I was just too proud, too afraid of admitting that I needed help, that I was failing." Outside, he could hear the sounds of the village waking up, chickens, a dog barking, someone calling out a greeting. Normal life, continuing on while Serafina fought for hers. "When you wake up," Julian said, "we're going to do things differently. You're going to run the shipping company properly, make all the decisions, and I'm going to listen, really listen, not just pretend while planning to do things my way." Her eyelids flickered. Hope surged in his chest. "Serafina, can you hear me?" Nothing. Just that slight movement, probably involuntary. "I know you can hear me," Julian said anyway. "You're too stubborn to leave, too brilliant to let some bastard bandits win. So you're going to wake up, and you're going to yell at me for being an idiot, and then we're going to go home and fix everything together." The door opened. "Doctor." Aldridge entered, carrying a basin of water and fresh bandages. "How is she?" Julian asked. "The same. I need to change her dressing." Aldridge set down his supplies. "You should step out." "No. Your Grace." "I'm staying." Julian's voice left no room for argument. "I've seen worse than this. I'll stay." Aldridge looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Julian's expression stopped him. "Fine, but don't get in my way." Julian watched as the doctor carefully unwrapped the blood-soaked bandages, revealing the wound beneath. It was worse than he'd imagined, angry red, swollen, oozing. The bullet hole itself was small, but the surrounding tissue looked inflamed. "Infected," Aldridge confirmed grimly. "Not badly, yet, but it will get worse before it gets better. I'll clean it again, apply fresh poultices. But mostly, we wait and hope." "That's it? Wait and hope?" "Unless you know some medical miracle I don't." The doctor began cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. "I've done everything I can, the rest is up to her." Julian felt helpless, useless. After everything he'd done to get her here, it still might not be enough. "There's something else you should know," Aldridge said as he worked. "The villagers are talking." "About what?" "About why the Duke of Ironridge was traveling through the woods with his wife, about why you were attacked, about whether it was truly bandits or something else." Julian stiffened. "What are they implying?" "Nothing specific, just gossip. But small villages like this, people talk, and they remember." Aldridge tied off the fresh bandage. "There, that should hold for now." After the doctor left, Julian sat alone with Serafina again, thinking about what Aldridge had said. Gossip, suspicion, as if he and Serafina were the suspicious ones rather than the victims. He shouldn't have been surprised. Nobility were always suspect in places like this, always viewed with a mix of resentment and distrust. And the circumstances were strange. A duke and his new wife, traveling without proper escort, attacked in the middle of nowhere. But what gnawed at Julian was something else. Something the bandit had said. "We know all about Lady Arkwright, the shipping magnate's daughter, the woman who controls the Vale fortune." They'd known exactly who she was, had targeted them specifically. Which meant this wasn't random highway robbery. It was planned. But by whom and why? Julian's exhausted mind tried to work through the possibilities, but he was too tired, too overwhelmed. Instead, he just held Serafina's hand and watched her breathe, willing her to keep doing it. "Wake up," he whispered. "Please wake up. I need you to wake up." But she didn't. 3 days passed in a blur of fear and waiting. Serafina's fever came on the second day, burning through her with terrifying intensity. Julian refused to leave her side, sleeping, when he slept at all, in the chair by her bed. He held her hand through the worst of it, listening to her delirious murmuring, words that made no sense but broke his heart anyway. Papa, the routes are wrong. Tell them. The ships can't use that passage. Tell Julian. I tried. I tried to help. Nobody listens. I'm listening now, Julian told her, even though she couldn't hear. I promise, I'm listening. Dr. Aldridge came and went, changing bandages, forcing water and medicine between her lips, his expression growing grimmer each time. The infection was spreading, he said. If it reached her blood, there would be nothing more he could do. On the third night, Seraphina's fever spiked so high that she began to convulse. Hold her! Aldridge barked, and Julian threw himself across the bed, pinning her shoulders as gently as he could while her body seized. Don't let her hurt herself. It lasted less than a minute, but felt like hours. When it finally stopped, Seraphina went utterly limp, her breathing so shallow that Julian had to put his ear to her mouth to confirm she was still alive. Is she? Not yet, Aldridge said grimly, but soon, if the fever doesn't break. Julian had never prayed in his life. The Arkwrights were nominally religious, but practically atheist, but he found himself doing something close to it that night, sitting beside Seraphina's too still form, begging whatever force governed the universe to let her live. I'll do anything, he thought desperately. Give up the estate, the title, everything. Just let her live. Dawn came. The fever hadn't broken. Julian watched the sun rise through the small window, feeling something inside him begin to crack. He had carried her 8 miles through darkness, had torn his body apart to get her to safety. And it still wasn't enough. She was going to die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Seraphina, for all of it, for wasting the time we had, for not seeing you, for being too late. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against her hand. I think I was starting to love you, he said. Isn't that ridiculous? 2 months of marriage, most of it spent ignoring you, and now that it's too late, I finally understand what I lost. Her hand was burning hot under his skin. Please, Julian whispered, please don't go. Outside, the village was waking. He heard voices, footsteps, the normal sounds of life continuing while his world ended. Then Seraphina's fingers moved. Julian's head snapped up. Seraphina? Her eyes were still closed, but her hand had definitely moved, squeezed his, just slightly. Can you hear me? Seraphina, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand again. Nothing. He waited, barely breathing, then, there. A definite squeeze, weak but unmistakable. That's it, Julian said, his voice shaking with hope. That's it. Come back. Come back to me. Her eyelids fluttered, opened. For a moment her gaze was unfocused, lost. Then she seemed to see him, really see him, and something like recognition flickered there. Julian, she whispered, the word barely audible. I'm here. I'm right here. He gripped her hand like a lifeline. How do you feel? Like shot. Despite everything, Julian almost laughed. Fair assessment. How long? 3 days. You've been unconscious for 3 days. He touched her forehead, still hot, but not as searingly as before. Your fever might be breaking. The bandits. Gone. We're safe. We're in a village called Millbrook, and you're going to be fine. He said it with absolute conviction, even though he had no idea if it was true. You're going to be fine. Seraphina's eyes drifted closed again, but she was still breathing, still holding his hand. Rest, Julian said softly. I'll be here when you wake up. And he was, when Dr. Aldridge came an hour later and confirmed that yes, the fever had finally broken. Julian felt something inside him unknot for the first time in days. She wasn't out of danger yet. The infection was still there, still fighting, but she'd turned a corner. She was going to live. You can go back to your own bed now, Aldridge suggested. Get some real sleep. But Julian shook his head. I'm staying here. Your Grace, I'm staying. And he did, through that day and the next, watching Seraphina drift in and out of consciousness, each time a little more alert, a little more herself. They didn't talk much. She was too weak, and he didn't know what to say. But he was there, and she seemed to take comfort in that. On the fifth day, she stayed awake long enough to ask the question he'd been dreading. What happens now? Julian looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in the pallor of her skin, the dark circles under her eyes, the bandages that wrapped her torso. She looked fragile in a way he'd never seen before, but her eyes were sharp, clear, waiting for an answer. Now, Julian said carefully, you heal, and when you're strong enough, we go home. And then, he took a breath, and then everything changes. Serafina held his gaze for a long moment, then so quietly he almost missed it. Promise? I promise. She closed her eyes, but this time there was something that might have been a smile on her lips. Julian sat back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Outside, he could hear the village going about its business, completely unaware that in this small room, something fundamental had shifted. He had married Serafina Vale for her money, had treated her as a solution to his problems, a walking bank account, an inconvenience to be managed. But somewhere in those 8 miles through darkness, somewhere in the terror of almost losing her, something had changed. She wasn't a transaction anymore. She wasn't a duty or an arrangement. She was his wife, his partner. And if they survived this, when they survived this, he was going to spend the rest of his life proving he was worth the second chance she was giving him, even if he had to carry her 8 more miles to do it. Even if he had to carry her 8 more miles to do it. But Julian would soon learn that the hardest journey wasn't through the forest. It was through the truth. On the 7th day of their stay in Millbrook, Serafina was strong enough to sit up without assistance. The wound was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. Dr. Aldridge had declared her out of immediate danger, though he insisted she remain bedridden for at least another week. Julian had sent word to Iron Ridge Hall, explaining the attack and their delay. He expected a response within days. Concern from the household staff, perhaps a carriage sent to retrieve them once Serafina could travel. What arrived instead was his cousin. Marcus Arkwright appeared at Dr. Aldridge's door on a rain-soaked afternoon, dressed in expensive riding clothes and wearing an expression of theatrical concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Julian, thank heaven you're alive." Marcus embraced him with the kind of forced warmth that made Julian's skin crawl. "When we received word about the attack, I came immediately. How is the Duchess?" "Recovering?" Julian said carefully. He and Marcus had never been close. There was too much history there, too many debts Marcus had conveniently forgotten. Too many times he'd appeared at Iron Ridge looking for money or favors. "What are you doing here?" "I told you, I was worried. We all were." Marcus glanced around the modest room with barely concealed distaste. "This is where you've been staying? Surely we can arrange better accommodations. There must be an inn." "Dr. Aldridge has been more than generous. We're staying here until Serafina is well enough to travel." Of course, of course." Marcus's smile was too wide, too practiced. "Might I see her? Pay my respects?" Every instinct Julian possessed screamed no, but he couldn't think of a reason to refuse that wouldn't sound paranoid. "Briefly," he said, "she tires easily." He led Marcus to Serafina's room, where she was propped up on pillows, reading from a book Mrs. Aldridge had loaned her. She looked up when they entered, and Julian saw the exact moment she recognized Marcus. Her expression shifted, just slightly, into something guarded. "Lady Arkwright," Marcus said, his voice dripping with sympathy. "What a terrible ordeal you've endured. I'm so relieved to see you recovering." "Mr. Arkwright," Serafina replied, her tone neutral. "This is unexpected. I couldn't stay away once I heard. Family must look after family, after all." Marcus pulled up a chair uninvited. "Julian told me it was bandits? How terrifying." "It was." "Did they get much? Valuables, I mean?" The question was casual, but something about it felt wrong to Julian, too interested, too specific. "Some jewelry," Serafina said. "Nothing irreplaceable." "Except you nearly died," Julian interjected sharply. "That's rather irreplaceable." Marcus had the grace to look abashed. "Of course. Forgive me, I didn't mean to sound callous. I was merely concerned about the financial impact. The estate can ill afford further losses." "The estate will be fine," Julian said, his voice cold. "Will it?" Marcus stood, walking to the window. "I've been reviewing the accounts, Julian. With you away, someone needed to ensure things kept running. And I'm afraid the situation is rather worse than you've been letting on. Julian felt ice settle in his stomach. You've been reviewing the accounts. On whose authority? On the authority of someone who cares about the family legacy. Marcus turned back to face him. Did you know you're 3 months behind on payments to the bank? That the tenant rents haven't covered operating costs in over a year? That if something doesn't change soon, Iron Ridge will be foreclosed on? That's not... Julian started, but Marcus cut him off. It's all documented. I can show you the ledgers. His expression was sympathetic, but his eyes were calculating. You've been trying to save the estate for years, cousin. Perhaps it's time to admit that some things can't be saved. Get out, Julian said quietly. Julian, get out of this room, now. Marcus held his hands up in mock surrender. Of course. I can see you're upset. We'll discuss this later when you're feeling more rational. He nodded to Serafina. My lady, I wish you a swift recovery. After he left, Julian stood trembling with rage, his hands clenched into fists. Julian, Serafina said softly. Look at me. He turned. She was watching him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that saw too much. What was that about? She asked. Marcus has always been a vulture, circling, waiting for Iron Ridge to fall so he can pick the bones. Julian sank into the chair Marcus had vacated. He's probably been hoping I'd fail for years. He knew about the attack very quickly, Serafina observed. How long would it take a messenger to reach Iron Ridge and for him to travel here? 5 days at minimum. We've been here 7 days. That means he must have left almost as soon as he heard. She paused. Or before. The implication hung in the air between them. You think Marcus had something to do with the attack? Julian said slowly. I think it's convenient. I think the bandits knew exactly who we were and what we were worth. I think someone told them. Serafina's voice was steady, but Julian could see the fear beneath the calm. And I think your cousin just happened to be very interested in the estate accounts the moment you were out of the way. Julian's mind was racing. Marcus stood to inherit Iron Ridge if Julian died without heirs. And with Serafina dead as well, there would be no widow to complicate matters, no fortune to save the estate. Just Marcus, stepping into a dukedom. We can't prove anything, he said. No, but we can be careful. Serafina reached for his hand. Very, very careful. That night, Julian lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and thinking about betrayal. He had known Marcus was untrustworthy, lazy, entitled, always looking for the easy path. But attempted murder, hiring bandits to kill his own cousin? It seemed impossible. And yet, we know all about Lady Arkwright. The bandit's words kept echoing in his memory. They'd known too much, had been too prepared, and the shot had been deliberate. Not a warning that went wrong, but a calculated attempt to make Serafina bleed out before help could arrive. Someone had wanted her dead, had wanted Julian desperate and alone, had wanted Iron Ridge vulnerable. The question was, could he prove it? The next morning brought another visitor, this one even less welcome than Marcus. Lord Ashford arrived in a gleaming carriage, accompanied by 2 men in the livery of the magistrate's office. He was an older man, barrel-chested and red-faced, with the self-important air of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Duke Arkwright, he announced, as if Julian's title needed declaring. I'm here on behalf of the county magistrate to investigate the attack on your person. The attack was a week ago, Julian said, already not liking where this was going. Rather delayed response, isn't it? These things take time. Witnesses to interview, evidence to gather. Ashford pulled out a notebook. Now, if you'll tell me exactly what happened. Julian recounted the attack, keeping his description factual. 6 or 7 bandits, masked, demanding valuables and information about the Vale fortune. The shot that nearly killed Serafina. His desperate flight through the forest. Ashford listened, making occasional notes, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. And you're certain these were bandits? He asked when Julian finished. What else would they be? Well, Your Grace, that's the question, isn't it? Ashford flipped through his notebook. We've had no reports of bandit activity in this area for over 2 years. The roads are well patrolled. And yet a duke and his wife, traveling with minimal escort, just happened to be attacked? Are you suggesting we invented this? Julian's voice was dangerously quiet. I'm suggesting the circumstances are unusual. Your wife inherits a fortune, you marry her hastily, and within months she's shot and nearly dies. Some might find that convenient. The accusation was so outrageous that for a moment Julian couldn't even speak. Convenient? He finally managed. I carried her 8 miles through a forest to save her life. Or to establish an alibi. Ashford's tone was infuriatingly reasonable. A dramatic rescue, a heroic husband. Very moving, but it doesn't change the facts. You needed money desperately. Your wife had money, and now she's been shot. Get out. Duke Arkwright, get out of my sight before I forget you're here in an official capacity and throw you out myself. Ashford stood, clearly affronted. The magistrate will want to speak with you both. Officially. I suggest you cooperate, Your Grace, unless you want people to wonder what you're hiding. After he left, Julian stood shaking with fury. It took him several minutes to compose himself enough to go to Serafina's room. She was already awake, sitting up in bed with that same guarded expression she'd worn yesterday. I heard, she said quietly. The walls are thin. They think I tried to kill you. Julian couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. They actually think... Of course they do. Serafina's tone was matter-of-fact. A nobleman marries a merchant's daughter for her money. The merchant's daughter is conveniently shot. Who else would they suspect? But I would never... I know that. But they don't. She folded her hands in her lap. Someone's been talking to them, Julian, filling their heads with suspicions. And I think we both know who. Marcus. It had to be Marcus. Plant the seed of doubt with the magistrate. Make Julian look like a fortune hunter who'd turned murderer. And even if nothing could be proven, the scandal would destroy him. Destroy them both. And when the estate finally collapsed under the weight of debt and disgrace, Marcus would be there to catch the pieces. What do we do? Julian asked. We prove you didn't do it, which means we prove who did. Serafina met his eyes. And then we destroy them. Dr. Aldridge had been listening from the hallway. He entered now, his expression troubled. You need to leave Millbrook, he said without preamble. Today, if possible. She's not well enough to travel, Julian protested. She's well enough to survive a carriage ride, which is more than I can say for what will happen if you stay. Aldridge crossed his arms. Lord Ashford has been asking questions in the village, stirring up trouble. There's talk of arresting you, Your Grace, taking you both back to the county seat for questioning. On what charges? Attempted murder, fraud. Does it matter? Once you're in custody, once the story spreads? Aldridge shook his head. Your reputation will be destroyed whether they prove anything or not. Julian looked at Serafina, who nodded slightly. We'll leave, Julian said, but not for Iron Ridge. If Marcus is behind this, going home plays right into his hands. Then where? Aldridge asked. Port Caldwell, Serafina said. We go to the shipping office, gather evidence of what's really happening with the business. And we find out who's been feeding information to bandits and magistrates. You're not strong enough. I'm strong enough to sit in a carriage, Serafina interrupted. And I'm certainly strong enough to fight for my life and my husband's name. She looked at Julian, assuming you're willing to fight alongside me? Julian thought of the separate rooms, the cold silences, the 2 months he'd wasted treating her like an inconvenience. Then he thought of her blood on his hands, her weight in his arms, the terrible possibility of losing her before he'd ever really known her. To the death, he said. They left Millbrook 3 hours later in a hired carriage with Aldridge's blessings and warnings. Julian had paid the doctor generously, more than generously, and the man had equipped them with bandages, medicines, and instructions for Serafina's care. Change the dressing twice daily, Aldridge said, handing Julian a bag of supplies. Watch for fever, and for heaven's sake, don't let her overdo it. I'm right here, Serafina said dryly from inside the carriage, and I can hear you. Then you'll hear this. You're recovering from a near-fatal wound. If you push yourself too hard, you'll undo everything we've accomplished. Understood? Understood. The journey to Port Caldwell should have taken 3 days. They made it in 4, stopping frequently to let Serafina rest, to change her bandages, to ensure she was managing the pain. Julian watched her like a hawk, ready to halt the journey at the first sign of trouble. But Serafina was tougher than she looked. She gritted her teeth through the worst of it, dozed when she could, and never once complained. On the second night, staying at a coaching inn, Julian sat beside her bed while she slept and thought about everything that had happened. 2 months ago, he'd married a woman he barely knew for money he desperately needed. He'd treated her with cold courtesy, kept her at arm's length, dismissed her intelligence and capability because it threatened his pride. Now someone was trying to destroy them both, and the only way to survive was to trust each other completely. Julian watched Serafina sleep, her face peaceful in the lamplight, and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, not quite, but it was the beginning of something. Respect, partnership, the foundation of what they could become if they survived long enough to build it. "I won't let them win," he whispered. "I promise you, Serafina, whatever it takes." Her eyes opened slightly, focusing on him with effort. "Stop making promises," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "Start making plans." Despite everything, Julian smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They reached Port Caldwell on the fourth day as the sun was setting over the harbor. The town looked exactly as Julian remembered: busy docks, ships crowding the water, the smell of salt and fish and opportunity. But something felt different now. Wrong, somehow. Davies, the harbor master, met them at the shipping office with barely concealed agitation. "Your Grace, Lady Arkwright, thank heaven you're here. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Julian asked. "The kind where 3 captains have quit this week. 2 ships have been impounded for unpaid docking fees, and someone's been spreading rumors that Arkwright Shipping is going bankrupt." Davies thrust a sheaf of papers at Julian. "And these just arrived this morning. Legal documents. Someone's trying to seize the company." Julian scanned the documents, his blood running cold. They were foreclosure notices, claims that Arkwright Shipping had defaulted on loans, failed to pay creditors, engaged in fraudulent practices. All of it was lies, but lies backed by official-looking paperwork and legal threats. "Who filed these?" Serafina asked, taking the papers from Julian's numb hands. Davies hesitated. "The claims come from multiple sources, but they're all being coordinated by the same solicitor. Firm out of London." "Let me guess," Julian interrupted. "Recommended by Marcus Arkwright?" "I don't know, Your Grace. But the solicitor's been asking a lot of questions about the Vale fortune, about Lady Arkwright's inheritance, about your marriage." Davies looked between them. "What's going on?" "Someone's trying to steal everything we have," Serafina said quietly. "And they're using the law to do it." The magnitude of it was staggering. This wasn't just an attack, it was a coordinated campaign. The bandits, the magistrate's investigation, the foreclosure notices, all timed to hit simultaneously, designed to overwhelm them, to force them into making mistakes. Julian felt rage building in his chest, hot and righteous. "Where's the solicitor now?" he asked. "Staying at the Harbor Master's Inn, arrived 2 days ago." Davies paused. "Your Grace, be careful. This man has powerful friends." "So do I," Julian said grimly. "Or I will, once I prove what's happening." That night, Julian and Serafina sat in the shipping office long after Davies had gone home, poring over ledgers and documents by lamplight. "Look at this," Serafina said, pointing to an entry. "This loan. We didn't take out this loan. The signature's forged." Julian examined it. She was right. The handwriting was close to his, but not quite. Someone had been practicing his signature, creating false documents. "And here," Serafina continued, flipping pages, "these shipping contracts, they're dated before our marriage. But I know these merchants. My father dealt with them. These terms are all wrong. Someone's been altering the records." "Creating a paper trail," Julian said slowly, "making it look like the company was failing before you came into the picture. So when it collapses now, it looks like mismanagement rather than sabotage." "Exactly." Serafina sat back, wincing at the pull on her wound. "Whoever's doing this is thorough. They've been planning it for months." Marcus," Julian said. "It has to be Marcus. He's the one who benefits if we lose everything." "Maybe." Serafina tapped the forged signature thoughtfully. "But I'm not sure Marcus is smart enough for this. This kind of coordination, this level of detail, it takes real intelligence. And more importantly, it takes someone with access to our business records. Someone who knew exactly when we'd be traveling, where we'd be vulnerable. Julian felt cold realization wash over him. Someone inside Iron Ridge, he said, or inside the shipping company, or both. Serafina met his eyes. We've been thinking of this as Marcus working alone, but what if he's not? What if there's someone else pulling the strings? Before Julian could answer, the office door slammed open. 3 men stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness outside. 2 were clearly hired muscle, broad-shouldered, scarred, carrying clubs. The third was smaller, better dressed, with the oily smile of a man who did his violence through paperwork. Duke Arkwright, the small man said. How convenient. I was hoping to find you here. You're the solicitor, Julian said, standing slowly. The one filing the foreclosure claims. Mr. Pemberton, at your service. The smile widened. And you're trespassing. This office is no longer Arkwright property. We're seizing it tonight on behalf of the creditors. The hell you are, Julian said. I have the legal documents right here. Pemberton pulled papers from his jacket. All properly filed and witnessed. This company is bankrupt, Your Grace, and unless you can produce proof of solvency, which we both know you cannot, I'm authorized to take possession immediately. Julian's hand moved toward the ledgers on the desk, the ones showing the forged documents, the altered records. But Pemberton saw the gesture and nodded to his men. They moved fast, grabbing Julian before he could react. One of them twisted his arm behind his back, while the other advanced on Serafina, who had struggled to her feet despite her wound. Don't touch her, Julian shouted, struggling against the grip. She's injured. Then she should have stayed home, Pemberton said mildly. He walked to the desk and began gathering up the ledgers, all of them, including the ones with evidence of forgery. Such a pity about your wife's accident, by the way. I heard it was quite dramatic. You carrying her through the forest and all. You son of a... Careful, Your Grace. Threatening an officer of the court is a serious matter. Pemberton tucked the ledgers under his arm. Now, I'm going to leave, and you're going to let me. Because if you don't, my associates here will be forced to restrain you, and I'd hate for your wife to have another unfortunate accident. The threat was clear. Julian looked at Serafina, who was pale but steady, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. Let them go, she said quietly. But the ledgers... Let them go, Julian. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to stop Pemberton from walking out with the evidence they needed. But the man holding him had a knife now, pressed casually against his ribs, and the other was too close to Serafina. He couldn't risk her. Not again. Smart choice, Pemberton said. I'll send word once the foreclosure is complete. Do feel free to submit a counterclaim, though I doubt it will do much good. He paused at the door. Oh, and Your Grace? My employer sends his regards. He's very much looking forward to assuming his rightful place at Iron Ridge. They left, taking the ledgers and any hope of proving the forgery with them. The moment they were gone, Julian pulled free and went to Serafina, who had sagged against the desk. Are you hurt? Did they... I'm fine. But her face was ashen, her breathing labored. We need to get those ledgers back. Serafina, you're bleeding. Julian saw the red seeping through her dress. The wounds opened again. Then we bandage it and keep going. She gripped his arm. Julian, listen to me. Those ledgers are the only proof we have. Without them, we can't fight the foreclosure, can't prove the forgery, can't expose whoever's behind this. I don't care about the ledgers right now. I care about keeping you alive. If we lose everything, we might as well be dead. Her voice rose, sharp with pain and frustration. Don't you understand? They're going to take Iron Ridge, take the company, take everything we have. And then what? We'll be destitute, disgraced, with a murdered reputation and no way to fight back. We'll survive, Julian said. We'll find another way. There is no other way. Serafina pushed away from the desk, swaying dangerously. This is it, Julian. This is our one chance to prove... She collapsed. Julian caught her before she hit the floor, his heart hammering. She was unconscious, her face white as death, blood soaking through the bandages. No, he whispered. No, no, no. Serafina, wake up, wake up. But she didn't wake. And when Julian pressed his fingers to her neck, her pulse was threading, barely there. He had a choice to make. Chase after Pemberton and the Ledgers, try to salvage some evidence to save their future, or get Serafina to a doctor, save her life, and let everything else burn. It wasn't really a choice at all. Julian lifted her into his arms, his body screaming in protest from muscles still damaged from the last time, and carried her out into the night. Davies lived 3 streets over. Julian made it 2 streets before his legs gave out. He went down on his knees in the middle of the road, still holding Serafina, and for the first time since he was a child, he felt tears burning in his eyes. He couldn't do this, couldn't save her, couldn't save the estate, couldn't fight enemies he couldn't even see. He was failing at everything, watching his entire world collapse, and there was nothing. "Your Grace?" Julian looked up. A woman stood in a doorway, lamplight spilling around her. He didn't recognize her, but she was staring at him with something like recognition. "Please," Julian managed. "My wife, she needs a doctor. Davies's house, do you know it?" "Aye," the woman called over her shoulder. "Thomas, bring the cart, quick!" Within minutes, they were moving again. Julian in the back of a rough cart with Serafina's head in his lap, the woman driving them through the dark streets to Davies's home. Davies answered the door in his nightshirt, took one look at Serafina, and immediately began shouting orders. His wife appeared with clean bandages and hot water. A boy was sent running for the doctor. Julian sat in their small parlor, numb and useless, while they worked to save his wife's life for the second time in 2 weeks. When the doctor finally emerged, a different man than Aldridge, younger, with tired eyes, he looked grim. "She'll live," he said. "But she's lost blood again. She needs rest. Weeks of it, minimum. No travel, no stress, no excitement. Can I see her?" "Briefly." Serafina was awake, barely. She lay in Davies's guest bed, so pale she looked like a ghost. "Did you get them?" she asked immediately. "The Ledgers?" "No." Julian took her hand gently. "I got you here instead." "Julian." "It doesn't matter. None of it matters except you being alive." He squeezed her fingers. "We'll find another way. Somehow, we'll find another way." Serafina closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "We've lost," she whispered. "Haven't we?" Julian wanted to tell her no, wanted to promise they'd still win, still fight, still survive, but he was so tired of promises. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe. Your Grace?" Davies appeared in the doorway, his expression strange. "There's someone here to see you, says it's urgent. Tell them to come back tomorrow. He says he has information about the attack, about who hired the bandits." Julian's head snapped up. "Send him in." The man who entered was young, nervous, dressed in the rough clothes of a dock worker. He twisted his cap in his hands and wouldn't meet Julian's eyes. "Speak," Julian commanded. I know who paid the bandits, Your Grace, to attack you and the lady." The worker swallowed hard. "And I know why. But if I tell you, I need protection. They'll kill me if they find out I talked." "Who's they?" The worker looked up, finally meeting Julian's gaze. "Your factor, Your Grace, Mr. Whitmore. He's been working with your cousin to steal the estate. Has been for years." The room spun. Whitmore. His father's old friend, the man who had managed Iron Ridge's business affairs since Julian was a child. Trusted. Loyal. A traitor. "How do you know this?" Julian demanded. "Because I was there when they planned it. I worked the docks, did work for Whitmore on the side, moving cargo, no questions asked. But 2 weeks ago I heard them talking, your cousin Marcus and Whitmore in the warehouse, about how once you and the lady were dead, they'd split the estate. Marcus would get the title, Whitmore would get the shipping company, and a cut of the Vale fortune." Julian felt sick. "They ordered the attack. Aye. Paid the bandits through me. I didn't know what it was for, I swear. They told me it was just to scare you, to rob you. I didn't know they were going to shoot the lady." The worker was crying now. "When I heard she nearly died, I couldn't stay quiet. It's murder, Your Grace, plain murder." "Will you testify to this?" Julian asked. "If you protect me. If you swear they won't kill me for it." "I swear it." Julian stood, his mind racing. Davies, keep this man safe. Lock him in your cellar if you have to, but don't let him out of your sight." "Where are you going?" Davies asked. Julian looked back at Serafina, who had struggled to sit up despite the doctor's protests. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw the same fury that was burning in his own chest. "To end this," Julian said, "once and for all." He left before anyone could argue, striding out into the night with purpose burning in every step. Whitmore's house was on the edge of town, a comfortable manor that had always seemed modest for a man of his position. Now Julian understood why. Whitmore had been siphoning money from Iron Ridge for years, hiding it away, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had come, and failed. Julian didn't knock. He kicked in the door and found Whitmore in his study, bent over paperwork that scattered when Julian grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You," Julian snarled, "you did this, you and Marcus." Whitmore's eyes went wide with fear. "Your Grace, I don't lie to me." Julian's fist connected with Whitmore's jaw, and the older man went down hard. "You hired the bandits, forged the documents, tried to kill my wife, tried to steal everything." "It was business," Whitmore gasped, blood on his lips. "Just business. The estate was dying anyway." "So you decided to kill it faster?" Julian hauled him up again. "Where's Marcus? Where is he?" "I don't know. He left town yesterday, said he was going back to Iron Ridge." Horror flooded through Julian. Iron Ridge, where the servants were loyal to him but unsuspecting, where all his personal documents were kept, where Marcus could destroy evidence, alter records, establish himself as the rightful heir, while Julian was stuck in Port Caldwell fighting foreclosure notices. "You bastard," Julian whispered. "You're destroying my home while I'm away." "It's not your home anymore," Whitmore smiled through bloody teeth. "By the time you get back, everything will belong to Marcus. The estate, the title, all of it. You're finished, Julian. Accept it." Julian let him drop and stepped back, his chest heaving. He should kill Whitmore. Should make him pay for the bullet in Serafina's side, for the betrayal, for everything. Every instinct screamed for violence, for revenge. But revenge wouldn't save Iron Ridge, wouldn't stop Marcus. "Davies!" Julian shouted. "Get the magistrate! Get everyone! I want this man arrested for attempted murder!" Then he ran. Back to Davies' house, where Serafina was trying to get out of bed despite the doctor's furious protests. "Julian?" she said when she saw him. "What?" "Marcus is at Iron Ridge, right now. He's going to destroy everything, the records, the proof, everything we need to fight him." Julian was already mentally calculating distances, travel times. "I have to go. Tonight." "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You're barely conscious, and you'll lose everything if you go alone." Serafina swung her legs over the side of the bed, her face going white with pain. "You need me, Julian. My testimony, my knowledge of the business, my fortune, all of it. Without me there to contest his claims, Marcus can say anything. You'll die if you try to travel. I'll die if we lose everything and end up destitute." She looked at him with those fierce, brilliant eyes. "We do this together, or not at all." The doctor was shaking his head. Davies looked horrified. Every rational part of Julian's brain screamed that this was insane. But Serafina was right. She was always right. "Fine," Julian said, "but we're not taking a carriage. We're taking the fastest horses in Port Caldwell, and we're riding through the night. Can you manage that?" "I'll manage." "If you fall off and die, I'll kill you." Despite everything, Serafina smiled. "Fair." They left within the hour, Julian on a gelding, Serafina on a mare, both animals fresh and fast. The doctor had given Serafina something for the pain, had bandaged her wound as tightly as possible, and had made Julian swear to stop if she showed any signs of distress. Julian had agreed. He was also prepared to completely ignore that promise if necessary. They rode into the darkness, away from the harbor and toward Iron Ridge Hall, racing against time and betrayal. And behind them, in the growing chaos of Port Caldwell, no one noticed the figure watching from the shadows, a figure who smiled coldly as the Duke and Duchess disappeared into the night. The trap was closing, and they were riding straight into it. The trap was closing, and they were riding straight into it. Julian pushed the gelding harder, knowing he was asking too much, but unable to stop. Behind him, Serafina kept pace on the mare, her face set in grim determination despite the pain he knew she must be feeling. They had been riding for 3 hours straight through the darkness, and the roads were treacherous with rain and mud. "How much farther?" Serafina called out, her voice strained. 5 miles, maybe less. Julian glanced back, checking on her for the 100th time. She was swaying in the saddle, barely holding on. "We need to stop, just for a moment." "No." The word was sharp, final. "We keep going." They crested a hill, and Iron Ridge Hall came into view below, a dark mass against the night sky, with lights blazing in nearly every window. Too many lights. Something was happening. Julian pulled his horse to a stop, and Serafina drew up beside him. For a moment they just stared at their home, ablaze with activity at an hour when it should have been dark and sleeping. "He's already started," Julian said quietly. "Whatever he's planning, it's happening now." "Then we end it now." Serafina straightened in her saddle, and despite her pallor, despite the blood seeping through her bandages, she looked like a warrior preparing for battle. Together. They rode down the hill at a gallop. The front courtyard was chaos. Carriages crowded the drive, horses stamping nervously, servants rushing back and forth with lanterns and luggage. Julian recognized some of the carriages, local gentry, minor nobility, people who had attended his wedding and then largely ignored him since. Why were they all here? He and Serafina dismounted. Julian had to catch her when her legs nearly gave out, and strode toward the entrance. A footman he didn't recognize tried to stop them. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private—" "Your Grace?" The footman's eyes went wide. "You're supposed to be in Port Caldwell." "Clearly not." Julian pushed past him. "Where's Marcus Arkwright?" "In the ballroom, Your Grace, with the guests. But you can't just—" Julian was already walking, Serafina beside him, both of them still in their travel-stained clothes, mud-splattered and exhausted. They must have looked like refugees rather than the Duke and Duchess of Iron Ridge. The ballroom doors were open, and Julian could hear voices inside, laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses. He paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. Marcus stood at the center of the room, dressed in expensive evening clothes, a glass of champagne in his hand. Around him, 24 of the county's most influential people milled about, drinking and talking. It looked like a party. No, it looked like a celebration. Tragedy, of course, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "My cousin and his poor wife, victims of a brutal attack. We can only hope they recover, though the doctors fear—" "I fear you're about to embarrass yourself," Julian said loudly. The room went silent. Every head turned toward the doorway where Julian and Serafina stood, filthy and furious. Marcus's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, fear, and finally, a desperate attempt at joy. "Julian! Serafina! Thank heaven you're alive! We heard such terrible reports!" "Save it!" Julian walked into the room, and the crowd parted before him like water. "What is this, Marcus? What are you doing in my home?" "Your home? Julian, I think you're confused. I've called these witnesses here tonight because—" Marcus gestured to a table laden with documents. "Because certain irregularities have come to light. Debts you've hidden, contracts you've forged. I'm afraid the title of Duke of Iron Ridge may need to pass to someone more capable." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Julian saw the calculation in their faces, the quick assessment of who was winning this confrontation, who they should align themselves with. "You're claiming I'm unfit to hold the title?" Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm claiming you're bankrupt, fraudulent, and possibly criminal." Marcus held up a document. "This is testimony from your own factor, Mr. Whitmore, detailing years of financial mismanagement. And these—" He indicated other papers. "These are foreclosure notices for the shipping company, proof that you've squandered your wife's fortune in a matter of months." "Those documents are forgeries," Serafina said, stepping forward despite the way her legs trembled. "Created by Whitmore and you to steal our estate." "My dear Lady Arkwright, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but making wild accusations is exactly what I'm going to do." Serafina's voice rang out clear and strong. "You hired bandits to kill us. When that failed, you began a legal attack designed to strip us of everything we own. And tonight, you've gathered witnesses to legitimize your theft. The crowd was murmuring now, heads turning between Marcus and Serafina, unsure who to believe. This is absurd, Marcus said, but Julian could see sweat beading on his forehead. I would never— We have proof, Julian said. A witness who heard you and Whitmore planning the attack. Who can testify that you paid the bandits, that you've been embezzling from the estate for years? A witness who conveniently appears just when you need one? Marcus laughed, but it sounded strained. Who would believe such an obvious fabrication? I would, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, stood there with an armful of ledgers, the real ones, not the doctored versions Marcus had been showing the guests. I've been housekeeper at Iron Ridge for 30 years, Mrs. Thornton said, walking into the room with quiet dignity. I've seen 3 dukes come and go. And I've also seen you, Mr. Marcus, sneaking into the estate office at odd hours. Saw you with Mr. Whitmore, whispering in corners. Saw documents disappear and reappear changed. Marcus's face had gone pale. You have no authority. I have eyes. Mrs. Thornton set the ledgers on a table. And I have these. The real account books, the ones His Grace kept locked in his private study, the ones showing every transaction, every decision, every penny spent. She looked at the assembled guests. If you want to know the truth about Iron Ridge's finances, read these, not the forgeries Mr. Marcus has been passing around. One of the guests, Lord Pemberton, the county magistrate, stepped forward and began examining the ledgers. His expression grew more severe with each page. These show no fraud, he said slowly. No embezzlement. The estate is in debt, yes, but the debts are being managed responsibly. And the shipping company— He looked up at Marcus. The shipping company shows a profit for the first time in years, as of last month. That's impossible, Marcus said. Whitmore showed you lies, Serafina said, because he was working with you to create a false narrative. But the truth is in those books. The truth is that this estate was being stolen from its rightful duke by his own cousin and factor. The tide was turning. Julian could see it in the faces around the room, suspicion of Marcus growing, sympathy for Julian and Serafina building. But they weren't there yet. Not quite. These ledgers could have been created tonight, Marcus said desperately, fabricated to cover their crimes. I demand an independent audit. I'll give you better than that, Julian said. He turned to the crowd. Every person in this room knows my father died in debt, knows I inherited an estate that was failing. What you don't know is that I've been trying to save it for 11 years, and I was failing, until I married Serafina. He took her hand, and she gripped his fingers tightly. My wife is smarter than me, Julian continued. Better at business, better at strategy, better at seeing solutions I was too proud to admit I needed. In the 2 months since our marriage, she's reorganized the shipping routes, renegotiated contracts, and turned a failing company profitable. She did what I couldn't, and that's why Marcus and Whitmore tried to kill her. Silence. Then one of the guests, Lady Ashford, the wife of the magistrate who had questioned them, spoke up. If that's true, why didn't you say so before? Why all the secrecy? Because I was ashamed, Julian said simply. Because I'm a duke, and dukes aren't supposed to need help from their wives. Aren't supposed to admit weakness. But my shame nearly got Serafina killed. Nearly cost us everything, so I'm done with shame. He turned to face the entire room, still holding Serafina's hand. My wife is the reason Iron Ridge has a future. She's the reason the shipping company is solvent. And she's the reason I'm standing here instead of lying in a grave somewhere, because without her intelligence and strength, I would have lost everything years ago. His voice grew stronger. So if you want to question whether I'm fit to be Duke of Iron Ridge, fine. Question me. But if you try to take this estate, you're not stealing from an incompetent nobleman. You're stealing from the woman who saved it. The room erupted in murmurs. Julian saw the shift happening, saw people looking at Serafina with new eyes, saw the whispers changing from suspicion to speculation to something that might have been respect. Touching speech, Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. But it changes nothing. The debts are real. The foreclosure notices are legal. And unless you can pay them, we can pay them, Serafina said. She reached into her riding jacket and pulled out a folded document, handing it to Lord Pemberton. This is a letter of credit from the Bank of London, she explained, authorizing the transfer of funds from the Vale estate to cover all outstanding debts against Iron Ridge Hall and Arkwright Shipping. Every penny owed, paid in full. Pemberton examined the document, and his eyebrows rose. This is substantial, more than substantial. Lady Arkwright, this is nearly your entire inheritance. I know. Serafina's voice was steady. I'm investing it in my husband's estate, in our future, in the business we're building together. Marcus was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. You can't just… I can. I am. Serafina turned to him, and her eyes were cold. You tried to kill me for this money, Marcus. Tried to make Julian a widower so you could claim the estate without the inconvenience of my fortune protecting it. But I'm alive, and my money is going exactly where I choose to put it. This is insane, Marcus turned to the crowd. She's clearly been coerced. My cousin has manipulated her, stolen her inheritance. I'm standing right here, Serafina said sharply, speaking for myself, making my own choices. If you think I'm being manipulated, you're welcome to ask me questions. I'll be happy to explain exactly how your scheme works, including the names of the bandits you hired and the amount you paid them. Marcus's face had gone from pale to red. I hired no one. This is a fantasy created by a hysterical woman. Call her hysterical again, Julian said quietly, and I'll break your jaw. The threat hung in the air, and Marcus took an involuntary step back. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. I think, given the circumstances, we should move this discussion to an official setting. Mr. Marcus, you're making serious accusations, but so are the Duke and Duchess. This matter requires a proper investigation. There's no need for an investigation, said a new voice. Everyone turned. Davies stood in the doorway, and beside him, flanked by two constables, was the dock worker, the witness who had heard Marcus and Whitmore planning the attack. This man has already given his testimony to the Port Caldwell magistrate, Davies said, walking into the room, including detailed descriptions of the meetings between Mr. Marcus Arkwright and Mr. Whitmore, the payments made to the bandits, and the plan to murder the Duke and Duchess. Marcus was backing away now, his eyes darting toward the exits. That man is lying. He's been paid to say, We also have Mr. Whitmore in custody, Davies continued, and he's been very cooperative, especially once we mentioned that attempted murder carries the death penalty. Whitmore would never, Marcus started, then stopped, realizing what he'd just implied. Never what? Julian asked softly. Never betray you? Never tell the authorities about your plan? Seems he already has. Marcus was trapped, and he knew it. Julian could see the calculation in his cousin's eyes, trying to find a way out, a story that would save him. Anything. There was nothing. Arrest him, Lord Pemberton said to the constables. Arrest Marcus Arkwright on suspicion of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a dozen other charges we'll work out later. The constables moved forward, and Marcus did the last thing Julian expected. He ran, shoved through the crowd, knocking people aside, and bolted for the French doors leading to the gardens. The constables shouted and gave chase, but Marcus had always been fast, and he had a head start. Julian started after him, but Serafina's hand on his arm stopped him. Let them go, she said. He can't get far. She was right. Through the windows, Julian could see Marcus running across the dark lawn, could see the constables gaining on him. Then a third figure appeared from the shadows, one of the estate's groundskeepers, a massive man who simply stepped into Marcus's path. Marcus tried to dodge. The groundskeeper caught him by the collar and lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing. It was over. The constables arrived, clapped irons on Marcus's wrists, and began hauling him back toward the house. Through the glass, Julian could see his cousin struggling, shouting something that was lost in the distance. The ballroom had erupted in conversation, everyone talking at once. But Julian only had eyes for Serafina, who had gone white as snow. You need to sit down, he said urgently. I need to… She swayed, and Julian caught her before she fell. I need to not collapse in front of all these people. Too late for that. He lifted her, ignoring the protests of his still damaged muscles, and carried her out of the ballroom, through the halls, and up to her rooms. Their rooms, he corrected himself. No more separation. Mrs. Thornton appeared with her usual efficiency, shooing Julian aside while she and two maids helped Seraphina out of her blood-soaked dress and into bed. A doctor was summoned, the local physician, who arrived flustered and overwhelmed. "She's torn the wound open again," he said after examining her. "Lost blood. She needs rest. Weeks of it. Months, ideally." "She'll get it," Julian said. After the doctor left, after the maids had been dismissed, Julian sat beside the bed and took Seraphina's hand. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified." Her voice was weak but steady. "I thought he might actually win. Thought we'd lose everything. But we didn't." "No, we didn't." She smiled slightly. "We make a good team, Duke Arkwright." "The best team." Julian raised her hand to his lips. "And from now on, everyone is going to know it." She was already falling asleep, exhaustion and blood loss finally claiming her. Julian sat there holding her hand, watching her breathe, and felt something settle in his chest. They had won. Not completely. There would be trials, investigations, months of cleaning up the mess Marcus and Whitmore had made. But they had won the battle that mattered. They had saved their home and each other. The next morning, Julian woke to find Seraphina still asleep and Mrs. Thornton waiting in the sitting room with tea and news. "The guests have all left," the housekeeper reported, most of them thoroughly scandalized. "Lady Ashford is telling everyone who'll listen that she knew Mr. Marcus was trouble all along." "Of course she is," Julian said dryly. "And there's been a development. Mr. Whitmore has signed a full confession. Names, dates, amounts stolen, everything." Mrs. Thornton poured tea with steady hands. "He's trying to save himself by giving evidence against Mr. Marcus. Says it was all your cousin's idea." "Was it? Does it matter? They're both guilty." She handed him a cup. "There's something else. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, the one who tried to seize the shipping office. He's fled. Left Port Caldwell in the middle of the night, but he left behind all his papers. And they show he was working for someone in London, someone with enough power to forge legal documents and bribe magistrates." Mrs. Thornton's expression was grim. "Mr. Marcus didn't do this alone, Your Grace. He had help. Important help." Julian's blood ran cold. "Who?" "We don't know yet. The name is redacted from all the documents, but whoever it is, they're wealthy and well-connected." She paused. "And they may try again." Julian thought of the coordinated attack, the bandits, the forgeries, the legal maneuvering. It had been too sophisticated for Marcus alone. He'd known that. But the idea that there was someone else out there, someone still in the shadows, waiting. "Then we'll be ready," he said. Over the next week, the truth spread through the county like wildfire. Marcus Arkwright and Whitmore had conspired to murder the Duke and Duchess, had forged documents, bribed officials, and very nearly succeeded in stealing one of England's oldest estates. But they had failed, and the reason they had failed was sitting up in bed in Iron Ridge Hall, directing the reorganization of the shipping company from her sickbed. Seraphina recovered slowly, but she recovered. The wound healed. The color returned to her cheeks. And her mind, sharp as ever, turned to the work of rebuilding everything that had been damaged. She pored over contracts and ledgers, dictated letters to captains and merchants, and slowly, methodically transformed Arkwright Shipping from a failing venture into something profitable. Julian watched her work with a mixture of awe and admiration. "You're staring," Seraphina said one afternoon, not looking up from the cargo manifest she was reviewing. "I'm admiring," Julian corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" But she was smiling. Julian crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed. "I've been thinking. Dangerous. I want to make you a partner, officially. In the shipping company, in the estate management, in everything." He took the manifest from her hands. "Not because you're my wife, because you're brilliant, because you've earned it, because I trust you more than anyone else in the world." Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. "You do realize that would scandalize half the ton? A duchess running a business?" "Let them be scandalized. I'm done caring what they think. Are you?" She tilted her head, studying him. "The man I married 3 months ago cared very much what people thought, cared about his pride, his reputation, his position. That man was an idiot, Julian said simply. This man knows better. Serafina laughed, a real laugh, bright and genuine. All right, partners. On one condition. What? You stop treating me like I'm made of glass. I'm recovered. The doctor says I can resume normal activities, which means I'm getting out of this bed and going to the shipping office next week. Serafina, I'm going, Julian. With you or without you. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice. It never had been. Together, he said. They traveled to Port Caldwell the following week in a proper carriage this time, with outriders and guards. Julian wasn't taking any chances, not until they knew who Marcus's London backer had been. The shipping office had been cleaned up, the forged documents removed, the real ledgers restored. Davies greeted them with genuine warmth and a thick folder of new business. Word spread, he said, setting the folder on the desk, about Lady Arkwright's reorganization of the routes, about the new contracts, about how you're actually turning a profit. He grinned. Suddenly, everyone wants to ship with Arkwright. We've got more business than we can handle. Serafina opened the folder and began reading. Julian watched her face light up as she saw the numbers, the possibilities, the future taking shape in columns of ink. We'll need more ships, she said. The Cormorant and the Osprey can't handle this volume. I'm thinking we commission 2 new vessels, one for the northern routes, one for the Mediterranean trade. That's expensive, Julian said carefully. It's an investment, one that will pay for itself in 2 years. She looked up at him. Unless you think it's too risky. I think if you believe it will work, it will work. Julian smiled. You haven't been wrong yet. Over the next hour, they discussed routes and contracts, cargo types and crew assignments. Davies contributed observations from the dock, and slowly, the shipping company that had been dying just months ago began to transform into something powerful. Someone knocked on the office door and a clerk entered nervously. Your Grace? There's a woman here to see you. Says she has information about the attack. Julian and Serafina exchanged glances. Send her in, Julian said. The woman who entered was middle-aged, plainly dressed, with the cautious manner of someone who wasn't used to speaking to nobility. She curtsied awkwardly. Your Grace, your ladyship. I'm Mrs. Cooper. I work in the kitchens at the Harbor Master's Inn. What information do you have? Serafina asked gently. It's about the solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, the one who fled. Mrs. Cooper twisted her apron. Before he left, I saw him meeting with someone, late at night, in one of the private dining rooms. They thought no one was watching, but I was cleaning the hallway. Who was he meeting with? Julian demanded. A gentleman from London, well-dressed, spoke like quality. I didn't hear much, but I heard him say something about how the plan had failed, how Marcus had been incompetent, and how they'd need to try a different approach. Mrs. Cooper looked frightened. He said they still needed to get control of the Vale fortune, that it was too valuable to let slip away. Julian felt cold settle in his stomach. The Vale fortune. Serafina's inheritance. That was what this had all been about. Not just Iron Ridge, not just revenge or greed, but the massive wealth her father had accumulated. Did you see this man's face? Serafina asked, her voice steady despite the fear Julian could see in her eyes. Aye, my lady. And I'd know him again if I saw him, Mrs. Cooper pulled a folded paper from her apron. I even drew him. I'm no artist, but I tried to capture his features. She handed the paper to Serafina, who unfolded it and went absolutely still. What is it? Julian asked. Do you recognize him? Yes. Serafina's voice was barely a whisper. It's my father's business partner, Mr. Carrington, the man who helped him build the shipping empire. The betrayal was staggering, not just Marcus and Whitmore, people Julian had known and mistrusted, but someone from Serafina's own past, someone her father had trusted, had been trying to steal her inheritance. Why would he? Julian started. The company, Serafina said, her mind clearly racing. When my father died, the partnership should have dissolved. Carrington should have gotten his share of the assets, but my father's will specified that I inherited everything. The ships, the warehouses, all of it. Carrington got nothing except what my father had already paid him. So he decided to take it by force, Julian said grimly. Not by force, by manipulation. by using Marcus and Whitmore to destroy us, to make me desperate enough to sell or to die. And then he could claim the business as the senior partner. Serafina's hands were shaking. He knew everything, every route, every contract, every vulnerability. He could have destroyed us completely. But he didn't, Julian said firmly, because you're smarter than him, and because we fought back. Serafina looked up at him, and he saw the fear giving way to anger. Good. Anger was better than fear. What do we do now? She asked. Julian turned to Mrs. Cooper. Will you testify to what you saw? In court, if necessary? Aye, Your Grace, if it helps catch the bastard who tried to hurt you and the lady. It will. Julian turned to Davies. Send word to London. I want Carrington's movements tracked, his business dealings investigated, everything he's done since Thomas Vale's death. That could take months, Davies warned. Then it takes months, but we're going to prove what he did, and then we're going to destroy him. They worked through the night, building their case. Letters were sent to London, to lawyers and investigators. The dock worker and Mrs. Cooper both gave detailed statements, and slowly, piece by piece, the conspiracy came into focus. Carrington had been stealing from the Vale Shipping Company for years, skimming profits and hiding the evidence. When Thomas Vale died and Serafina inherited everything, Carrington knew she'd discover the theft eventually. So he'd arranged for her to marry Julian, a desperate nobleman with failing finances, knowing the marriage would make her vulnerable. Then he'd used Marcus and Whitmore to attack from multiple angles: financial pressure through the estate, legal pressure through the shipping company, and physical violence through the bandits. It had almost worked. But Serafina had been too smart, too strong, and Julian had been willing to change, to listen, to fight alongside her, instead of dismissing her. We make a formidable team, Serafina said, reading through the evidence they'd compiled. Don't we? Unstoppable, Julian agreed. 3 weeks later, they had enough evidence to bring charges. Carrington was arrested in London, caught trying to flee to the continent with embezzled funds. The magistrate called it one of the most elaborate fraud cases he'd ever seen. The trial would be sensational. But Julian and Serafina didn't care about sensation. They cared about justice. Standing in the shipping office, watching Serafina direct the loading of a new cargo shipment with the easy authority of someone born to command, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not just for the estate, though that was secure now. Not just for the shipping company, though that was thriving. But for their marriage. For the partnership they were building. For the future they would create together. Serafina turned and caught him watching. What? I was just thinking about our wedding, Julian said. How miserable we both were. How wrong everything felt. And now? Now it feels right. He crossed to her, took her hands. I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. For the separate rooms, for the silence, for treating you like a transaction instead of a partner, for wasting time we'll never get back. Julian, I'm not finished. He squeezed her fingers gently. I married you for money. That's the truth. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But that's not why I'm still married to you. I'm still married to you because you're extraordinary. Because you challenge me and surprise me and make me want to be better than I am. Because when I thought I was going to lose you, I realized that losing the estate would have been nothing compared to losing you. Serafina's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're going to make me cry in front of the dock workers. Let them see. Let everyone see. Julian pulled her close, careful of her still healing wound. I love you, Serafina. I don't know when it happened. Maybe somewhere in that forest, maybe before, maybe it's still happening now. But I love you, and I need you to know that. I love you too, Serafina whispered against his chest. Even though you're stubborn and proud and took 2 months to figure out what I knew from the start. What did you know? That we were meant to be partners. That we were stronger together than apart. She pulled back to look at him. That despite everything, this could actually work. Julian kissed her then, properly, in the middle of the shipping office with Davies and the dock workers pretending not to notice. And for the first time since their wedding, it felt like a beginning instead of an ending. They had fought their way through darkness and betrayal, had survived bandits and conspiracies and the cruelty of society, had nearly died and definitely bled, but they had won, together, and the victory tasted sweeter than anything Julian had ever known. But sweetness, Julian was learning, required constant tending. The trial of Marcus Arkwright and Edmund Carrington began on a grey morning in November, 6 months after the attack in the forest. London's Central Criminal Court was packed, nobility curious about the scandal, merchants invested in the outcome, journalists scribbling frantically in their notebooks. The ton had descended like vultures, hungry for drama. Julian and Serafina sat in the front row, her hand clasped firmly in his. She wore deep blue silk that made her look regal and untouchable, though Julian could feel the tension in her fingers. This was the moment everything would be decided, their future, their reputation, their very lives. Marcus was brought in first, thinner than Julian remembered, his expensive clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost its aristocratic bearing. He wouldn't meet Julian's eyes. Then came Carrington, silver-haired, distinguished, still carrying himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. He looked at Serafina with something like pity, as if she were a foolish child who had misunderstood a simple business arrangement. The prosecutor stood, a sharp-faced man named Thornhill, who had made his career dismantling the crimes of the wealthy. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case concerns 2 men who believed themselves above the law. One, a nobleman who felt entitled to his cousin's estate. The other, a businessman who felt entitled to his partner's fortune. Together, they orchestrated a conspiracy that led to attempted murder, fraud on a massive scale, and the near destruction of one of England's oldest ducal estates. Over the next 3 hours, Thornhill laid out the evidence with brutal efficiency. The dockworker testified about overhearing the conspiracy. Mrs. Cooper described Carrington's meeting with the fled solicitor. Whitmore, hoping to save his own neck, provided devastating details about the forgeries, the embezzlement, the carefully orchestrated attacks. But the most damning testimony came from Serafina herself. When she took the stand, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Women rarely testified in major criminal trials. It simply wasn't done. But Serafina had insisted, and no law prevented it. "Lady Arkwright," Thornhill said gently, "please tell the court what happened on the day of the attack." Serafina's voice was steady, clear. "My husband and I were returning from Port Caldwell when masked men stopped our carriage. They demanded valuables, but they also demanded information about my inheritance. Specific information, account numbers, property deeds, details that a common bandit wouldn't know to ask for. And then what happened? The leader said they knew exactly who I was. The shipping magnate's daughter, the woman who controlled the Vale fortune." Serafina's hand moved unconsciously to her side, where the scar still pulled tight. "Then he shot me. Not as a warning, not by accident. He aimed for my torso, intending to cause a wound that would kill me slowly, far from any doctor." "Why do you believe that was intentional?" "Because I've seen enough of violence to know the difference between a warning shot and an execution." Her eyes found Carrington. "And because the man who ordered it knew exactly how isolated we were, how far from help, how unlikely we were to survive." Carrington's lawyer objected, claiming speculation. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Serafina's conviction, her certainty, the scar tissue of trauma beneath her composed exterior. Then it was Marcus's lawyer's turn. "Lady Arkwright, isn't it true that you married the Duke of Ironridge for his title? That you used your fortune to buy your way into the aristocracy?" "Yes," Serafina said calmly, and the courtroom gasped. "I married for a title and social position. My husband married for money. That was our arrangement." "So you admit this was a mercenary union?" "I admit it started that way. Many marriages do." Serafina's gaze was unwavering. "What matters is what it became. And it became a partnership. One that Mr. Marcus Arkwright and Mr. Carrington tried to destroy because they couldn't control it." "Or perhaps," the lawyer suggested, "you're fabricating this conspiracy to cover your own mismanagement of funds. To explain why the Vale fortune has been depleted—" "The Vale fortune hasn't been depleted," Serafina interrupted. It's been invested in Arkwright Shipping, which is now profitable for the first time in a decade, in the Iron Ridge estate, which is solvent and expanding, in businesses across 3 counties that are employing hundreds of people. If you call that mismanagement, then I'm guilty. But if you call that building a future, then I'm succeeding beyond anything my father dreamed possible. The lawyer had no response to that. Neither did the courtroom, which had fallen absolutely silent. When Julian was called to testify, he spoke plainly about carrying Serafina through the forest, about finding the conspiracy's breadth, about the systematic destruction Marcus and Carrington had attempted. My cousin believed he deserved Iron Ridge more than I did, Julian said. Perhaps he was even right. I was failing when he made his move. But he didn't try to help the estate. He tried to destroy it, because destruction served his purposes better than restoration. And Mr. Carrington? Mr. Carrington saw my wife as an obstacle to wealth he believed belonged to him. He couldn't accept that Thomas Vale had chosen his daughter as his heir, so he tried to eliminate her. Julian's voice hardened. He nearly succeeded. The trial lasted 8 days. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty, on all counts, for both men. Marcus Arkwright was sentenced to 20 years transportation to Australia. Edmund Carrington, as the mastermind and for the attempted murder, was sentenced to hang. The courtroom erupted. Journalists fled to file their stories. Nobility whispered behind fans and gloved hands, and Julian pulled Serafina into his arms, holding her while she trembled with relief and exhaustion. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." "Is it?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching. "The trial is over. But what about everything else? The estate, the business, us?" "Those," Julian said, "are just beginning." They returned to Iron Ridge Hall as heroes. The Ton, fickle as always, had shifted its opinion entirely. Suddenly, everyone had known Marcus was untrustworthy. Everyone had suspected Carrington of malfeasance. And everyone was absolutely fascinated by the Duchess, who had survived an assassination attempt and rebuilt a shipping empire from her sickbed. Invitations poured in, balls, dinners, country weekends. The same people who had ignored Serafina for being a merchant's daughter now fought for her attention. "It's nauseating," Serafina said one evening, sorting through the stack of cards. "They act like they were on our side all along." "They were on the winning side all along," Julian corrected. "We just finally became it." "Do we have to accept any of these?" Julian looked at her, his wife, his partner, the woman who had saved his estate and possibly his soul, and saw the exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. The trial had drained her. The constant scrutiny was draining her still. "No," he said, taking the invitations and tossing them in the fireplace. "We don't have to accept any of them. We can stay here, run the estate and the business, and let London gossip without us." "Really? Really, I'm done performing for people who wouldn't have helped us when we needed it." Julian pulled her close. "Let's just be us for a while. Fix the estate, build the business, figure out what we want our life to look like." Serafina rested her head against his shoulder. "That sounds perfect." So they did exactly that. Over the next year, Iron Ridge Hall transformed. The repairs that had been delayed for decades finally happened. Roofs fixed, walls reinforced, windows replaced. The tenant farms received new equipment and updated drainage systems. The forests were managed sustainably, replanted and harvested with an eye toward the future. And Serafina's influence was everywhere. She established a school for tenant children, reasoning that educated farmers made better decisions. She brought in new breeding stock for the sheep, transforming the wool quality. She even convinced Julian to convert one of the failing grain fields into an experimental crop rotation system that doubled yields within 2 seasons. "You're turning Iron Ridge into a merchant enterprise," Julian observed one afternoon, watching her review plans for a new dairy. "I'm turning it into a functioning enterprise," Serafina corrected. "One that makes money instead of hemorrhaging it. My ancestors are probably rolling in their graves. Your ancestors ran the estate into the ground. I'd rather they roll than haunt us." She looked up from her plans. "Unless you'd prefer we return to the old methods? Tradition over profit?" Julian laughed. "After everything we've been through, I'll take profit, thank you." Arkwright Shipping flourished even more dramatically. With Carrington's assets seized and redistributed, Serafina had the capital to commission 3 new ships, fast, modern vessels that could compete with anything on the seas. She hired the best captains, negotiated exclusive contracts with merchants across Europe, and established a reputation for reliability that her father would have envied. Within 18 months, the company had doubled in size. Within 2 years, it was one of the most profitable shipping operations in England, and everyone knew who was responsible. The Merchant Duchess, the papers called her. Some meant it as an insult, a reminder that she wasn't true nobility, but most used it with respect, even admiration. Serafina had proven that intelligence and business acumen mattered more than bloodlines. Julian couldn't have been prouder. He had his own role, of course. He managed the estate's day-to-day operations, dealt with the social obligations Serafina had no patience for, and used his title to open doors that might have stayed closed to a woman. But he never pretended to be the architect of their success. "My wife built this," he told anyone who asked about Iron Ridge's revival. "I just tried not to get in her way." It became their reputation, the Duke who admitted his wife was smarter than him, and the Duchess who didn't need his admission to prove it. 2 years after the trial, on a spring morning bright with possibility, Serafina made an announcement. Julian found her in the estate office, staring at a letter with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What is it?" he asked. "Bad news?" "No, strange news." She handed him the letter. "It's from the Board of Trade. They want to appoint me to an advisory position, something about recognizing exceptional contributions to British commerce." Julian read the letter, his eyebrows rising. "This is extraordinary. They've never appointed a woman to this board." "I know. That's what makes it strange." Serafina crossed her arms. "Do you think it's genuine, or is this some new political game?" "Does it matter?" Julian set down the letter. "You've earned this. Whether they're appointing you because they recognize your talent or because they're trying to appear progressive, either way, you deserve the position." "You think I should accept?" "I think you should do whatever makes you happy." He moved closer, took her hands. "You've spent 2 years rebuilding our life. Maybe it's time to think about what you want for yourself." Serafina was quiet for a long moment. "I want to accept. I want to prove that a woman can contribute to national policy, that we're not just decorative. But I also want—" She trailed off, looking uncertain in a way Julian rarely saw. "What?" "A family." The words came out soft, almost embarrassed. "I want children. I want to build something that lasts beyond us. Is that foolish?" Julian felt his chest tighten with emotion. "That's not foolish. That's beautiful. But the timing is impossible. If I accept this position, I'll be traveling to London constantly. And if we start a family, then we'll figure it out," Julian interrupted. "The same way we figured out everything else. Together." He pulled her close. "You don't have to choose between being brilliant and being a mother, Serafina. You can be both." "Can I?" "You carried a shipping empire while recovering from a gunshot wound. I think you can manage a career and a family." Serafina laughed, the tension breaking. "When you put it that way." She accepted the position, and 3 months later she told Julian she was pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult, morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made Serafina furious at her own body, complications that had the doctors worried. But Serafina approached it with the same determination she brought to everything, working from bed when necessary, delegating when possible, and absolutely refusing to be treated like an invalid. "I'm growing a human, not dying of consumption," she snapped at Julian when he suggested she rest instead of reviewing shipping contracts. "I can do both." "You're impossible. You married me anyway." Their daughter was born on a winter night, small and perfect and screaming with impressive volume. They named her Margaret after Serafina's mother and Thomas for Serafina's father. Julian held his daughter for the first time and felt something in him fundamentally change. This tiny, furious creature represented everything they had fought for: a future, a legacy, hope incarnate. "She's going to be brilliant," Serafina said from the bed, exhausted but glowing. "I can already tell." "She's going to be terrifying," Julian corrected. "With you as her mother, the world doesn't stand a chance." "Good. The world needs more terrifying women." They raised Margaret at Iron Ridge, in rooms that were warm and full of life instead of cold and empty. The estate that had been dying when Julian inherited it was thriving now, profitable, sustainable, a model for modern agricultural management. And Serafina's influence extended far beyond their own lands. Her position on the Board of Trade gave her a platform to advocate for changes that had been needed for decades. Better labor conditions for sailors, regulations on shipping safety, support for women entering commerce. She made enemies, certainly, but she also made progress. "You're changing the world," Julian told her one evening, watching her prepare for a board meeting. "I'm annoying powerful men until they give me what I want," Serafina corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "One sounds heroic. The other is just accurate." Margaret grew up watching her mother command respect in rooms full of men, watching her father support that without insecurity or shame. She learned to read shipping manifests before she learned to read novels. She understood profit margins before she understood poetry. "We're ruining her," Julian said one afternoon, finding 5-year-old Margaret explaining to a visiting duchess why diversified investments were superior to land holdings. "We're preparing her," Serafina replied, "for a world that's going to try to tell her she can't do things because she's a woman. She'll already know that's nonsense. She's going to be unstoppable, just like her mother." The years passed, each one building on the last. Iron Ridge Hall became famous not for its ancient lineage, but for its innovation. Arkwright shipping expanded into new markets, new technologies, new possibilities. And the Duke and Duchess of Iron Ridge became known as the couple who had revolutionized what a noble marriage could be. "Partnership," Serafina said during a speech to young women at the school she'd founded. "That's the secret. Not romance, not duty, not tradition. Partnership. Finding someone who sees your potential and helps you reach it. Who trusts you enough to let you lead when you're best suited for it. Who loves you for exactly who you are, not who society says you should be." Julian, sitting in the audience, felt his throat tighten. He thought of their wedding day, that cold transactional ceremony where neither of them had imagined loving the other. Thought of the months of silence and distance that had followed. Thought of the bullet that had nearly taken her from him. And then he thought of everything that had come after. The partnership they'd built. The empire they'd expanded, the daughter they were raising, the life they'd created from the ashes of desperation. After the speech, after the applause had faded and the audience had dispersed, Julian found Serafina in the garden behind the school. She was standing beneath an old oak tree, looking at the building with satisfaction. "Proud of yourself?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Proud of us," Serafina corrected. "This school exists because we fought for Iron Ridge, because we refused to let Marcus and Carrington win, because we built something worth protecting. You built this school. With your support, with the profits from the estate you manage, with the security of knowing you'd defend it if anyone challenged it." She looked at him. "We did this together, Julian, just like we do everything." Julian took her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. 10 years of marriage, and he still felt a thrill when she touched him. Still marveled that this brilliant, fierce woman had chosen to stay with him. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The marriage, I mean. Starting the way we did?" Serafina considered the question seriously. "I regret the time we wasted, the months of silence and separation, but regret the marriage itself? No." She squeezed his fingers. "Because if we'd started differently, if we'd married for love instead of necessity, we might not have fought so hard to make it work. We might have given up when things got difficult. Instead, we got shot at, nearly destroyed, and had to rebuild everything from the ground up." "Exactly. And look what we built." Serafina gestured at the school, at the town beyond, at the life they'd created. "We built something real, something that matters, something that will outlast us." Julian pulled her close, careful as always of the scar on her side, the permanent reminder of how close he'd come to losing her. "I love you," he said. "I don't say it enough, but I love you. Everything you are, everything you've made us become." "I know." Serafina rested her head against his shoulder. "I love you too, even though you were an absolute disaster when we married." "Was? Are? Present tense. But you're my disaster." They stood like that for a while, watching the sun set over the estate that had almost been lost, the empire that had almost been stolen, the future that had almost died in a dark forest. But it hadn't died. Because Julian had carried Serafina 8 miles through the darkness, refusing to give up even when his body was breaking. Because Serafina had fought back from the edge of death with the same determination she brought to everything. Because they had chosen, again and again, to trust each other. That night, they returned to Iron Ridge Hall, the house that Serafina had rebuilt with her own hands, literally in some cases, directing renovations and design choices that had transformed it from a monument to the past into a home for the future. Margaret was already asleep, her nanny reading quietly beside the bed. Julian and Serafina stood in the doorway for a moment, watching their daughter breathe, this perfect combination of everything they'd fought for. "She's going to change the world," Serafina whispered, "just like her mother already has." Later, alone in their rooms they'd shared for 8 years now, the separate chambers long since converted to other uses, Julian traced the scar on Serafina's side with gentle fingers. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. "Sometimes, when the weather changes, when I'm tired." She caught his hand. "But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Now it's just part of me. A reminder." "Of what?" "Of how close we came to losing everything, and of how far we've come since then." She turned to face him. "That bullet should have killed me. The infection should have killed me. The fever, the blood loss, all of it. I should have died in that forest. But you didn't. Because you wouldn't let me. You carried me through the darkness, Julian, literally and figuratively. And when I was strong enough to walk again, you walked beside me instead of ahead of me. That's why we're here. That's why we survived." Julian kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. "We're quite a team, aren't we? The best team. Unstoppable. Insufferable. Changing the world one stubborn decision at a time." "I'll take it." Years later, when Margaret was grown and running Arkwright Shipping herself, expanding it to territories her mother and grandfather had never imagined, she asked her parents about the attack, about the conspiracy, the trial, the near destruction of everything they'd built. They sat in the garden at Iron Ridge, the same garden Serafina had designed 25 years earlier. The oak trees had grown tall. The roses had spread. The estate was thriving under Margaret's management, just as it had thrived under Serafina's. "Were you scared?" Margaret asked her mother. Serafina, gray now but still fierce, still brilliant, considered the question. "Terrified," she said honestly. "I thought we'd lose everything. Thought I'd die before we could prove what Marcus and Carrington had done. Thought your father and I would end up destitute and disgraced. But you fought anyway. We didn't have a choice. When you're pushed to the edge, you either fall or you fight. We chose to fight." Margaret turned to Julian, who was older now but still strong, still steady. "And you? Were you scared?" "Every day," Julian said. "I was scared when I married your mother for money, scared when I realized I was failing, scared when she was shot, scared when I carried her through that forest, thinking every step might be the one where she died in my arms." "So what made you keep going?" Julian looked at Serafina, his partner of 30 years, the woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. "Love," he said simply. "Not the romantic kind. We didn't have that yet. But the kind that refuses to give up on someone, that sees their potential even when they can't see it themselves. That carries them through darkness because the alternative is unthinkable." "And then the romantic kind came later?" Margaret asked, smiling. "Much later," Serafina confirmed. "After the shooting and the trial and rebuilding the estate. After we'd proven we could survive the worst together. That's when I fell in love with your father. When I realized he saw me as a person, not a fortune. As a partner, not a possession. And I fell in love with your mother," Julian added, "when I realized she was everything I'd needed all along. Not a solution to my problems, but a person who made me want to solve them myself, who made me better." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, "I'm glad you were scared. I'm glad it was hard, because if it had been easy, you might not have built all this." She gestured at the estate, at the school in the distance, at the life they'd created from desperation and determination. "Exactly," Serafina said. "Easy doesn't build empires, Easy doesn't change the world. Easy just exists. And we were never meant to just exist, Julian added, taking Serafina's hand, the gesture as natural after 3 decades as it had been foreign at 3 months. We were meant to fight, to build, to prove that partnership is stronger than pride. That evening, after Margaret had left to tend to her own family, she'd married a brilliant engineer, much to Serafina's delight, and had 2 children who showed signs of inheriting their grandmother's business acumen. Julian and Serafina walked through Iron Ridge Hall one last time before bed. The house was full of life now. Servants moved through hallways that had once been empty. Light spilled from windows that had once been dark. And everywhere, there were signs of the empire they'd built. Shipping manifests on desks, agricultural reports in the study, letters from around the world seeking Serafina's advice on commerce and Julian's on estate management. "We did all right, didn't we?" Julian said, pausing in the ballroom where Marcus had tried to steal everything. "We did more than all right. We built something extraordinary." Serafina leaned against him, comfortable in a way that came from decades of partnership. "From a marriage neither of us wanted, we created a legacy that will outlast us both. And it all started with 8 miles through a forest, and a stubborn duke who refused to let his wife die, and a brilliant duchess who refused to stay invisible." They stood there in the ballroom, remembering. The cold wedding, the silent months, the bullet and the blood and the desperate race through darkness, the trial, the rebuilding, the love that had grown from ashes. "If you could go back," Serafina asked, "to that wedding day, knowing everything that would happen, would you still do it?" Julian didn't hesitate. Every moment, every hardship, every fight, because they all led to this, to us, to the life we built together. Even the part where I almost died? Especially that part, because that's when I realized what you meant to me, when I understood that losing you would be worse than losing everything else combined. He kissed her temple. "I'd walk 8 miles through darkness 1,000 times if it meant getting to spend my life with you." "You're getting sentimental in your old age. I'm getting honest in my old age. There's a difference." Serafina laughed, the sound echoing in the grand room where they'd faced down Marcus and won. "Well, in that case, I'd do it all again too. The cold marriage, the silence, the attack, all of it, because it forged us into something stronger than we ever could have been separately. Partnership. Partnership," she agreed, "the kind that changes the world." They climbed the stairs to their rooms, moving slower now than they once had, but still together, still side by side. And when they finally settled into bed, the same bed they'd shared for decades, in the rooms that had once been separate prisons, Julian held Serafina close and thought about how far they'd come. From a transaction to a partnership, from strangers to soulmates, from a house that was dying to an empire that was thriving, all because a desperate duke had married a merchant's daughter and both of them had been stubborn enough to fight for what they built together. "Thank you," Julian whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For not giving up on us. For being stronger than me. For building this life." "We built it together," Serafina corrected, her voice already drowsy. "That's the point. Together." "Together," Julian agreed. And as he drifted off to sleep, holding the woman who had saved him in every way that mattered, he thought about the scar on her side, the permanent mark of how close they'd come to losing everything. But scars weren't just reminders of pain, they were proof of survival. Evidence that you could be broken and still heal. That you could face the worst and still build something beautiful from the wreckage. The scar on Serafina's side had marked the moment everything changed. When a silent bride became the heart that rebuilt an empire. When a cold husband became a partner worth trusting. When a marriage of convenience became a love story that would echo through generations. In the morning, they would wake and continue the work they'd started decades ago, running the estate, guiding the shipping company, advising the next generation. The empire they'd built required constant tending, constant care. But that was all right, because they had built it together, and together they were unstoppable. The Duke and Duchess of Iron Ridge, the merchant and her noble, the partnership that had survived assassination, betrayal, and the cruelty of society. They had won. Not just the battles, but the war. Not just survival, but triumph. And when historians looked back on the transformation of Iron Ridge Hall from dying estate to thriving empire, they would point to that night in the forest as the turning point. The moment when a desperate man carried his wounded wife through 8 miles of darkness and emerged on the other side as something more than he'd been. A partner. A husband. A man who had finally learned that strength wasn't about pride or control. It was about refusing to give up on the person you loved, even when everything else had fallen apart. Especially then.